The tree had been dead for years. Anyone could see that. The bark had gone gray and papery, the branches stripped bare by a winter nobody in Creswell County remembered being particularly harsh, and the roots had buckled the earth around the base into a pattern of cracked ridges, like something old and stubborn refusing to let go of the ground even after everything else had given up on it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most people who walked the back edge of Ridgemont Road didn't look at it twice. It was just a dead tree at the end of a dead stretch of land that nobody claimed and nobody wanted, half swallowed by kudzu on one side and pressed against a rusted wire fence on the other, the kind of fence that existed not to keep anything in, but to let the world know that someone, at some point, had cared enough to draw a line. Nadia Voss was not most people. She stopped in front of that tree the way she stopped in front of most things, slow and careful. The way you move when your whole life has taught you that rushing past things leads to stepping on the wrong piece of ground. She had been sleeping in the drainage ditch 200 yards east for 11 days. Before that, a church shelter in Millhaven that ran out of beds on a Thursday when 3 families came in from a flooded trailer park and the numbers stopped working in her favor. Before that, a car that belonged to a man named Gerald who had seemed kind for about 6 weeks before he stopped being kind in the particular way some men stop, all at once, like a switch. Before Gerald, a woman named Pat who rented her a room in a house with 6 other women and a policy about no personal items left in the bathroom. Before Pat, a job at a food processing plant that paid $11 an hour and smelled like rendered fat and fluorescent light. She was 23 years old. She looked 40 in the eyes. The envelope was nailed to the tree about 4 feet up, which was why most people missed it. At eye level, the tree had nothing to offer. But Nadia was short, 5'2", and she had a habit of looking at things from odd angles because odd angles were where she had learned the world kept its surprises. She saw the corner of it first, just a pale triangle peeking out from beneath a strip of bark that had curled away from the wood like a lip pulling back. Her brain registered paper before she consciously understood what she was looking at. She pulled the bark aside. The envelope was old, that much was obvious. The kind of yellow that takes years, not months. But it had been wrapped in something, some kind of waxed cloth now blackened and stiff, and the wrapping had done its job. The paper beneath was intact. The envelope was sealed, not glued, sealed with a red wax that had cracked in 2 places but still held the flap down. Across the front, in handwriting so old it looked like something from a different century, 3 words in faded ink. For the worthy. Nadia stood in front of that tree for a long time. She was not a superstitious person. She had been raised by a grandmother who believed in hard work and practical shoes, and the specific mercy of keeping your mouth shut when someone with power was in the room. Her grandmother had died when Nadia was 16, and after that the practical shoes became impractical very quickly, because practical required a floor to stand on, and floors cost money, and money required a job, and jobs required an address, and addresses required money, and around until the circle ate itself, and she was 23 years old looking at an envelope nailed to a dead tree at the edge of a road nobody drove on. She took the envelope. She told herself she would open it somewhere dry. The underpass at the junction of Route 9 and the county road had 3 concrete columns that blocked the wind from 2 directions, and Nadia had been using it as a secondary shelter since her first week in Creswell. She kept a change of clothes in a plastic bag wedged between the middle column and a supporting beam, and a tin box with matches, a small candle stub, and $4.37 that she had not yet spent because she was saving it for a specific emergency she hadn't yet defined, which meant she was saving it for the next time the world surprised her in the bad way, which was the only kind of surprise she had come to expect. She sat with her back against the column, knees up, candle lit, and held the envelope. The wax seal was 2 interlocked letters, an R and a V, stylized in a way that suggested someone had designed it rather than just pressed a ring into wax. She turned the envelope over twice. No address. No return address. No postage. Whoever had put this on that tree had carried it there by hand, nailed it, and left it. She broke the seal. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter, 4 pages long, written in the same formal hand as the front of the envelope, with a date at the top that she read 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. The second was a folded document, heavier stock, official-looking, with a gold embossed seal in the top left corner. She read the letter first. It began with a name she had never heard in her life. Reginald Ambrose Voss. It began with his name, and then it explained who he was. And by the end of the first paragraph, Nadia's hand was not shaking, which seemed wrong, because her hand should have been shaking given what she was reading. But her hands had stopped doing that a long time ago. The same year, she stopped crying at things that deserved crying, which was the year she learned that shaking and crying cost energy she couldn't afford. Reginald Ambrose Voss had been her great-great-uncle. He had died in 1987. He had been born in 1899. He had lived, for most of his adult life, on an estate called Voss Grange, which sat on 412 acres of land in the hill country above Cresswell, and which contained a main house, 3 outbuildings, a working well, a spring-fed pond, a timber stand worth what the letter estimated as a significant sum, and a subsurface mineral lease arrangement that had been generating revenue into a trust account for over 30 years. The letter was written by a man named Thomas Caraway, who identified himself as Reginald's attorney, and who had drafted the letter in 1986, the year before Reginald died, at Reginald's direct instruction. The letter explained that Reginald had no children, that his brothers had produced children, and those children had produced children, but that Reginald had watched the family fracture along lines of money and resentment until he could no longer trust that any of the obvious heirs deserved what he had built. He had written the estate through a specific trust with a specific condition. The deed would not transfer through standard probate. It would wait. It would wait in an envelope on a dead tree at the edge of his land for someone who found it not because they were looking for it, but because they were the kind of person who looked at things from the right angle. I have no way of knowing who will find this, the letter said, in Caraway's careful penmanship recording Reginald's exact words. I have no way of knowing when. But I have spent 87 years learning that the right person for any task is not always the loudest, or the most connected, or the one already standing in the room. Sometimes the right person is standing outside in the cold, looking up at something everyone else walked past. If you were reading this, you were paying attention when others weren't. That is enough. That is, in my experience, everything. The document was a deed of title. The deed of title to Voss Grange. The property transferred, per the terms of the Reginald Ambrose Voss Perpetual Trust, to the bearer upon presentation of this document and the accompanying letter to the office of Caraway and Associates, Attorneys at Law, 44, Meridian Street, Cresswell, with any associate of the firm acting as administering trustee upon Caraway's death. The value line at the bottom of the deed, filled in by hand, read $410 million. With a note beneath it that the figure was a 2019 appraisal and that current market valuations should be sought at time of transfer. $410 million. Nadia sat under the underpass with the candle burning down and the 4 pages of the letter spread across her knees and the deed held in both hands, and she read it again. Then again. Then she blew out the candle because the candle had maybe 30 minutes left and she didn't know when she would find another one. And in the dark she sat with the paper against her chest and listened to the cars going over the road above her. She did not cry. She made a list. It was the kind of list her grandmother would have made. Practical. Sequential. Stripped of hope because hope was a luxury and right now what she needed was logic. 1. Was this real? 2. If it was real, why had no one else found it? 3. If she walked into a law office looking the way she currently looked, which was like a woman who had been sleeping in a drainage ditch for 11 days, would they take her seriously? For what happened to someone who tried to claim something this large and got it wrong? She did not answer any of the questions that night. She folded the papers back into the envelope, tucked the envelope inside her jacket against her ribs, and lay down on the cardboard she used for insulation, and she looked up at the underside of the road above her, and she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother's name had been Iris. Not Iris Voss. Iris Beaumont, because the Voss name had been lost a generation back through marriage, and then lost further through a family that didn't keep records, didn't keep in touch, didn't keep much of anything except a low-level suspicion that they had once been connected to something they couldn't name. Iris had mentioned the name once. Nadia was maybe 9. They were eating soup that was mostly broth, and Iris had said, in the particular way she said things she thought were too important for conversation, that the Voss blood ran in them, and the Voss blood was proud blood, stubborn blood, the kind that didn't ask for things because it didn't need to. Then she had gone back to her soup. Nadia had been 9 and had filed it away without understanding it, the way children file away things adults say that have weight without explanation. She was 23 now, and lying in an underpass with $410 million pressed against her ribs, and she understood it. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed about the tree. In the dream it was alive, green and enormous, and she was standing at the base of it looking up through the branches at a light she couldn't reach, and the bark under her hands was warm. She woke up before dawn with the cold settled into her bones the way cold settles when you've been on the ground too long, deep and specific, the kind that makes your joints feel like they've been packed with gravel. She sat up, checked inside her jacket. The envelope was there. She checked the $4.37. Still there. She needed to think before she walked into that law office. The problem with $410 million is that it attracts attention the moment you mention it, and attention is not always the kind that helps you. Nadia had learned this about smaller amounts of money, had learned that the moment you told people you had something, the telling created 100 ways for them to take it. She had watched women at the shelter whisper about a woman who'd won $300 on a scratch ticket, and by the end of the week, 2 people had borrowed it, and 1 person had reported a rumor that she'd won more, and the $300 was gone before she could cash it. $300. She was sitting on $410 million, and she didn't have a phone, a working address, a government ID that wasn't expired, or a single person in Cresswell who knew her name. That was either a problem or an advantage. She spent 2 days deciding which. She spent those 2 days in the public library, which opened at 9 and closed at 6, and had bathrooms where she could wash her face and a children's section in the back corner where nobody bothered you if you were quiet and reading, which she was. She read about estate law. She read about perpetual trusts. She read about adverse possession and deed transfer and the specific legal mechanisms by which property changed hands in situations that weren't standard, and by the end of the second day, she understood enough to know 3 things. The trust, if it was real, was real. The mechanism Caraway had used was unusual, but not unprecedented. There were documented cases of delayed transfer trusts with bearer deed conditions, mostly from the early and mid-20th century, mostly from wealthy eccentrics who had complicated feelings about their heirs. The law office address, 44 Meridian Street, existed. She found it in an old county business directory from 2009. Caraway and Associates, established 1952. Whether it still existed, she didn't know. 2009 was a long time ago, and Caraway himself had been writing letters for a man who was already 87 in 1986, which meant Caraway was almost certainly dead, which the letter had anticipated, which was why it said any associate of the firm. She went to 44 Meridian Street on a Thursday morning. She had washed her hair in the library bathroom the night before, using the hand soap and staying in the stall until the librarian knocked and told her they were closing. She had put on the clean shirt from the plastic bag at the underpass. She had rubbed her shoes against her jeans until the worst of the mud came off. She looked like what she was, a young woman who had made an effort under difficult circumstances. She could not look like anything else because she did not have access to anything else, and she had decided that trying to perform wealth she didn't have would make her seem worse than being honest. She walked to Meridian Street, which was 6 blocks from the library, in a part of downtown Cresswell where the buildings were old and mostly offices, insurance agencies, and a real estate broker and an accounting firm with a sign that needed repainting. Number 44 was a narrow brownstone with a brass plate by the door, tarnished but legible. Caraway and Associates. Established 1952. The lights inside were on. She stood outside it for 4 minutes. She was not afraid. She had stopped being afraid of specific things the year after her grandmother died, because after that year she had discovered that the worst that could happen was usually just another version of what had already happened, and she had survived that. What she felt standing outside Caraway and Associates was not fear. It was the particular weight of a moment she could feel was hinging, the way a door feels heavier right before you push it open, not because the door has changed, but because you know something will be different once you cross through it. She pushed the door open. The reception area was small and smelled like old paper and coffee. A woman about 50 sat behind a desk, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a phone tucked between her ear and shoulder. She held up one finger without looking at Nadia and finished her call, made a note on a yellow pad, and looked up. She was the kind of woman who could assess a situation without her face showing the assessment. Nadia recognized the type. Her grandmother had been that type. "Can I help you?" Nadia put the envelope on the desk. "I need to speak with whoever currently administers the Reginald Voss Trust," she said. The woman's face did not change, but something moved behind her eyes. She looked at the envelope, then at Nadia. "Can I ask where you got this?" "A tree," Nadia said, and then because that sounded wrong without context, she added, "It was nailed to a dead tree on the eastern boundary of the Ridgemont Road property. I found it 11 days ago." The woman picked up the envelope, careful, by the edges. Held it the way someone holds something they recognize. She stood up. "Please wait here." She went through a door in the back and Nadia heard muffled voices, then silence, then more voices. She sat in the reception chair and looked at a framed print on the wall of a covered bridge in autumn. The kind of print that had been on that wall for 30 years and would be there for 30 more, and she breathed in and out and made herself stay still, because stillness was what you had when everything else was uncertain. The door opened. The man who came through was maybe 65, thin, in a gray suit that fit him the way suits fit people who have worn them their whole lives. He had reading glasses in his breast pocket and a particular quality of stillness that meant he had received surprising information and was deciding how to hold it. He held out his hand. "My name is David Harwell. I'm a senior associate here. I've been with Caraway and Associates for 32 years. Emmett Caraway died in 2003. I administered his practice afterward, and I've been the trustee for the Voss instrument since then." He paused. "Please come into my office." The office had bookshelves on 3 walls and a window that looked out onto the back of another building. He sat behind the desk, and she sat across from it, and he opened a drawer and pulled out a file folder so thick it had 2 rubber bands around it, and he set it on the desk with the particular care of something that had been waiting. He opened it. The first page was a photocopy of the deed she was holding, or rather, the deed she had returned to him, because he had taken it when she laid it on his desk, and she had not asked for it back, which was either trust or fatalism or both. He looked at his copy, then at the original she had brought. He said nothing for a long time. "Ms. Voss," he began. "My last name is Beaumont," she said. "My grandmother was Iris Beaumont, née Voss. I don't use the Voss name. I didn't know I had it until I read that letter." Harwell nodded slowly. "You'll need to establish the lineage. It's a condition of the trust. Reginald's instructions were specific. The bearer must demonstrate Voss blood through documentary evidence." He paused. "I have to tell you something honestly." She waited. "In 32 years, 3 people have come into this office claiming to have found the envelope." He looked at the desk. The first was 2001. The second was 2014. The third was 2019. In all 3 cases, the envelope they presented was a copy or a forgery, or in one case an envelope that had been manufactured to look plausible. He looked up. "The wax seal on the one you've brought is the original Voss seal. I know this because I have a photograph of it in this file, taken in 1986 when Caraway prepared the instrument. The cracking pattern in the wax matches." He sat back. "This is, to the best of my knowledge, the first time the original document has been presented at this office." Nadia looked at the file folder. "What happens now?" she said. "What happens now is that I need to verify your lineage, which will take time and require documentation. If you have a birth certificate, your grandmother's death certificate, any marriage records that trace back to the Voss family." "I have a birth certificate," she said. "I don't carry most of those things. My grandmother's papers are in a storage unit in Millhaven. I stopped paying for it 4 months ago. I don't know if they've cleared it." Harwell made a note. "I also need to tell you something else," he said. "The trust has been generating revenue since 1991, when the mineral lease arrangement came into effect. The account has not been touched." He opened to a tab in the folder, turned it to face her. She looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. The way the figures sat on the page, in plain type, was harder to process than the written-out words had been on the letter. Written out. A number is language, and language can be misread, can be dismissed, can be a mistake in transcription or comprehension. But a number on an accounting statement, with columns and dates and a running balance that had been updated as recently as 60 days ago, was a different kind of real. It was the kind of real that her grandmother would have said was practical, which was the highest compliment Iris Beaumont gave to anything. The mineral lease revenue alone over 32 years, combined with the timber sales the trust had managed and the property appreciation, had brought the total asset value to $412,700,000 and some change. She did not cry. She asked for a glass of water. He got it himself. While he was gone, she looked at the covered bridge print on his wall, which he also had, but in a smaller frame, and she thought about the drainage ditch. She thought about the way the water ran through it when it rained, how she had learned to move her cardboard uphill to avoid the seepage. She thought about the church shelter in Millhaven and the 3 families from the trailer park who had taken the last beds, and she thought about them without resentment, because they had needed those beds, and she had found her way to an underpass and then to a dead tree, and maybe that was the trade. He came back with water and a box of tissues which he set on the desk without comment, which was kind. She drank the water. He sat. The process, he said, will take time. You will need legal representation of your own. He held up a hand. Not because I'm advising you not to trust this office. Emmett Carraway was a man of integrity, and I have tried to be the same. But you are about to be the subject of significant attention, and you need someone specifically representing your interests. How long will the whole thing take? She asked. If the lineage documentation can be assembled, and if the family, he paused. There are living Voss descendants who have been aware of the trust's existence for some years. There have been challenges to the instrument in court. All of them have failed because no original deed was ever presented. But they will likely mount a challenge again when they become aware that you exist. He looked at her steadily. This will not be fast, and it will not be quiet. She thought about quiet, about the underpass, about the particular quiet of a place where no one is looking for you because you have nothing anyone wants. She would not have that quiet anymore. She understood that in the way you understand things that are true before you're ready for them. How long? She asked again. He considered. Conservatively? 6 months to establish lineage and file the transfer. Another 6 months to a year if there are serious legal challenges. In the meantime, the trust will continue to generate revenue, and as the identified claimant, you may be eligible for a living stipend from the trust while the transfer is pending. It's in the instrument. He found the page. The identified bearer, pending verification, shall be entitled to reasonable living expenses from the trust at the discretion of the administering trustee. He looked up. I would consider $2,000 a month reasonable. $2,000 a month. For 11 days, she had been measuring life in terms of whether she could afford a $4 can of soup without breaking into her emergency fund. $2,000 a month felt like a number from someone else's life. She said, I'll take it. He nodded. You'll need an address for disbursement. Do you have somewhere to stay? No. He made another note. There's a motel on Clement Street. The Haverford. It's clean, and they rent by the week. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Tell them David Harwell sent you, and that the billing will be handled through this office until the stipend arrangement is formalized. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Because Emmett Carraway spent 32 years hoping this day would come. He believed Reginald was right, that the right person would find that envelope, and that when they did, they'd deserve what was inside it. He looked at the file. And because you're sitting in my office with 11 days of a drainage ditch on you and a deed to a $400 million estate in your hand, and you haven't cried or demanded anything or asked me to just hand it all over right now. He paused. You made a list. I could see it in your eyes the moment you walked in. You were working through the problem before you had any reason to believe the problem had a solution. He closed the folder. Emmett would have liked you. She picked up the piece of paper with the motel address. She stood. She put out her hand, and he shook it. The walk to the Haverford Motel on Clement Street took 12 minutes. She counted them. 12 minutes between the life she had been living and the first concrete step towards something else, which was not yet real and would not be real for many months, but which was moving from the territory of impossible into the territory of merely difficult, and difficult she knew how to walk toward. The motel was clean, as he had said. The woman at the front desk, whose name tag said Barbara, made one phone call, talked for 3 minutes, and handed Nadia a key to room 7 without asking any questions that a person in Nadia's current state couldn't answer. This was either professionalism or the particular mercy of someone who had seen enough of life to know when questions would only make things worse. Room 7 had a bed with a blue coverlet, a small bathroom with a shower, a television she didn't turn on, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where a man was loading boxes into a truck with the steady, methodical movement of someone who had done this job for years and found it sufficient. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put the envelope on the nightstand. She looked at it. Then she lay down, still in her shoes, and stared at the ceiling, which was white and water-stained in one corner, and she thought about her grandmother, who had said the Voss blood was proud and stubborn and didn't ask for things, and she thought, "Iris, I didn't ask. I just looked at the right angle." She fell asleep before she meant to, the deep and boneless sleep of someone whose body has been waiting for a flat surface and permission to stop for 11 days. She woke up at 4:47 a.m. She lay still for 3 full minutes before she understood why she had woken up. It was not a noise. It was the absence of one. No traffic from an overhead road. No wind through concrete columns. Just the particular silence of a room with walls and a door that locked from the inside. She got up, turned the shower on as hot as it went, and stood under it until the water started to cool. She stood at the bathroom mirror after, which she had not looked into in a focused way for some time, because mirrors in public bathrooms had a specific cruelty to them, the fluorescent light and the half-second delay in your own eyes that made you a stranger to yourself. This mirror was smaller and kinder, lit by a single lamp from the bedroom, and she looked at herself without flinching. 23 years old. The face looking back at her was not the face of someone who had gotten everything wrong. It was the face of someone who had been handed a very difficult equation and had kept working it. She thought about what came next. She thought about it methodically, which was the only way she knew. The Lineage documentation was the first problem. The storage unit in Millhaven was 4 months in arrears. She didn't know if they had cleared it yet. She needed to get there before they did, if they hadn't. That meant transportation, which meant the stipend, which meant waiting for the formal arrangement, which meant time she might not have. She needed to talk to Harwell about getting some portion of the money immediately, enough for a bus ticket and 1 day in Millhaven. The second problem was the family, the living Voss descendants. She knew nothing about them except that they had been challenging the trust in court, which meant they had lawyers, which meant they had money, which meant they had spent some portion of whatever resources they had trying to prevent exactly what had just happened. When they found out she existed, and they would find out, because this was the kind of information that moved fast through channels she wasn't part of, they would not be quiet about it. She knew this the way she knew most things, not from experience with this specific situation, but from experience with the general category of people who felt entitled to something and then found out it had gone elsewhere. She needed her own lawyer before they made their first move. Harwell had said this. She believed him. The third problem was that she had not eaten since yesterday morning at the library, where she had consumed a granola bar she'd found in her jacket pocket, and she was hungry in the functional way that meant her thinking would start to degrade if she didn't address it. There was a vending machine at the end of the motel hallway. She had $4.37, which she had not yet spent, which felt important to spend on this, on feeding herself in the first morning of whatever this was. She bought a bag of peanut butter crackers and a bottle of water and brought them back to room 7. She sat on the bed with her grandmother's voice in her head, which was not a supernatural thing, just the specific way some people's minds retained the people they'd loved, the particular cadence of their advice. Iris would have said, "You don't eat the whole jar at once. You eat what you need for today, and you put the jar somewhere safe, and you come back for more when you're ready." She ate the crackers. She drank the water. She thought about the dead tree. It had stood at the edge of that property for years, decades probably, and hundreds of people had walked past it on Ridgemont Road, and not one of them had stopped. Or maybe some had stopped and not looked at the right angle. Maybe some had seen the envelope and left it because they didn't trust it, or because they thought it wasn't for them, or because the particular combination of circumstances that produces a person who pulls a nailed envelope off a dead tree had never aligned until she walked past it at the end of 11 days in a drainage ditch. She wondered who had nailed it there. Carraway himself, maybe. In 1986, doing one final thing for a client who had trusted him, carrying an envelope up the back edge of a property that would be in trust for decades, hammer and nail, and the specific faith required to believe that the right person would eventually come. She wondered how many times he had driven past that tree between 1986 and his death in 2003. She wondered if he had looked at it the way she now found herself looking at the motel room door, like something on the other side of it was still becoming. She opened the notebook she kept in her jacket, the one she used for lists and thinking, and she wrote down everything she knew. Not the money, not the estate, but the chain of events. Dead tree. Envelope. Harwell. Storage unit. Living descendants. Legal representation. Stipend. Documentation. She numbered the items. She put a circle next to the ones she could address in the next 24 hours. Then she lay back on the blue coverlet and let herself do the one thing she had not done since she read Reginald Voss's letter in the underpass by candlelight. She let herself imagine what the estate looked like. 412 acres. A main house. 3 outbuildings. A spring-fed pond. A timber stand. Hill country above Cresswell, which meant elevation, which meant views, which meant the kind of land that looks like something from the kind of painting that costs more than everything she had ever owned combined. In her imagination, it was overgrown, because it had been held in trust and managed at distance, and managed at distance was not the same as loved. She had read enough about estate management to know that trustees kept things maintained to a legal standard, which was different from the standard of someone who lived there and cared about every particular corner of a place. She imagined it overgrown. She imagined walking the perimeter. She imagined the pond and whether it had a dock and what a person would see from that dock at a specific hour of morning when the light came at an angle across the water. She thought, I haven't seen a place like that since I was 9 years old, and my grandmother took me to a state park for the one and only vacation we ever took, and we sat by a lake, and she told me the Voss blood was proud, and I didn't know what she meant, and now I do. She thought, Iris, I found it. She fell back asleep. When she woke up the second time, it was daylight, real daylight, and someone was vacuuming the hallway, and the world was ordinary and specific and present, and she was in it, and $412 million was waiting at the end of a process she had not yet begun. She got up. She went to the vending machine and bought a cup of bad coffee from the machine next to it, the kind that came in a small foam cup and tasted like coffee's distant memory of itself. She drank it standing in the hallway. Then she went back to room 7, sat at the small desk, and opened her notebook. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, Day 1. And then she got to work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The bus to Millhaven left at 7:15 a.m. and took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Harwell's assistant, a young man named Marcus who wore sweaters and spoke quietly, had arranged for $40 in petty cash from the trust's administrative account to cover the ticket and incidentals while the formal stipend was being structured. She paid for the ticket with the $40. She kept the $4.37 separate. She did not spend it. It felt important that she not spend it yet, though she couldn't have said why exactly. She had called the storage facility from the motel phone before leaving. The woman who answered confirmed that Unit 114, registered to Iris Beaumont, had indeed been flagged for clearance at 4 months of non-payment, but that the clearance had not yet taken place because the facility was backlogged and the earliest a crew could clear it was the following week. She confirmed that if Nadia could pay the arrears before the crew was dispatched, the unit would be removed from the clearance list. 4 months of non-payment at $60 a month was $240. She didn't have $240. She called Marcus back. He called Harwell. Harwell called the facility directly, explained that he was the attorney administering a trust on behalf of the registered renter's heir, and provided a credit authorization for the arrears. The woman at the facility said she would make a note. This was how it started. The particular way money worked when you had it, or had someone acting on your behalf who did. A phone call resolved in 20 minutes what she had been dreading for 4 months. The unit had hovered in the back of her mind the whole time she had been on the street, the box with her grandmother's papers, the photographs, the documents, all of it sitting in a concrete cube in Millhaven while the clock ran down. She had not been able to stop thinking about it and had not been able to do anything about it, which was the specific cruelty of poverty, that the things you most need to protect are the things you are least equipped to reach. The bus smelled like vinyl and diesel and a perfume someone in the back was wearing, something with artificial vanilla, and Nadia sat by the window and watched the landscape shift from town to highway to the stretched-out flatness of the county before the hills came back up on the other side. She had not been on a bus in a year that was going somewhere she chose to go. Every bus she had taken in the previous 18 months had been going away from something. Away from Gerald. Away from the plant. Away from the room at Pat's house, when Pat raised the rent without notice. Away. Buses going toward places she didn't fully want to be, chosen because they were affordable and available and led somewhere that had not yet failed her. This bus was going toward something. She watched the window. She thought about the other 3 people who had brought fake or forged envelopes to Caraway and Associates. 2001, 2014, 2019. 3 people who had heard about the trust somehow, had known enough to construct a plausible attempt, and had failed because the original document was specific in ways that couldn't be faked without access to materials no one had. She thought about the family, the living Voss descendants. What had they told the people who tried? Or had those people found out through other means, some slip in public records, some mention in a local history somewhere, some inheritance hunter who had tracked the trust and decided to roll the dice? She did not know. She thought about what Harwell had said. They will mount a challenge again when they become aware that you exist. She thought, they don't know yet. She thought, time is a resource the same as money. The storage facility in Millhaven was off the highway, a long row of orange-doored units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that smelled like dust and forgotten things, and the specific sadness of objects that outlived the people who cared about them. She paid the arrears at the office window, received the access code, and walked down the road to Unit 114. The padlock was the one she had bought with her grandmother's spare key. It opened on the first try. Inside, Iris Beaumont's remaining life took up approximately 4 square feet of cubic space. A plastic bin with her kitchen things, plates and cups wrapped in newspaper. 2 boxes of books. A garment bag with her good coat and her church dress. A flat cardboard box that Nadia knew contained photographs. And at the back, a fireproof metal box, small, gray, the kind you bought at a hardware store to hold important papers, with a combination she had memorized at 16 because Iris had made her memorize it along with the combination to the old safe at their apartment, treating both with the same seriousness. Left, 22. Right, 8. Left, 31. She knelt on the concrete floor and opened it. Inside were the documents of a life. Iris Beaumont's birth certificate. Her marriage certificate to Gordon Beaumont, deceased. Gordon's death certificate. Nadia's mother's birth certificate, listed as Celia and Beaumont, which was a name Nadia held for a moment because she had not thought of her mother's full name in a long time, because her mother had left when Nadia was 4, and the leaving had been total in the way some leavings are, no forwarding address, no birthday calls, no particular explanation offered to a grandmother raising a 4-year-old on a fixed income who hadn't asked for any of it, but had done it anyway without complaint. Beneath Celia's birth certificate was Iris's own mother's birth certificate. And beneath that, a piece of paper that was older than everything else in the box, fragile at the folds, typed on a machine whose keys had been slightly uneven, so some letters pressed harder than others. It was a family record, the kind churches used to keep, the kind of document that traced a lineage through baptisms and marriages and deaths across several generations. And there at the top, unmistakable, was the name that Harwell needed. Iris Helen Voss, born 1931, daughter of Raymond Voss and Marie Dupont Voss. Raymond Voss, born 1901, son of Arthur Voss, brother of Reginald Ambrose Voss. She sat on the floor of the storage unit in Millhaven with the document in her hands and the cold concrete under her knees, and understood that her grandmother had known. Not the details, maybe. Not the trust. Not the envelope, not the $410 million. But the name, the blood, the stubborn proud thing that didn't ask for what it needed. Iris had known who they were and had said so exactly once, over soup that was mostly broth, to a 9-year-old who couldn't understand it. She had not said more because more wasn't hers to claim, or because she hadn't known more, or because the Voss way of being was to state a thing once and let it sit, and let the person who needed it find it when they were ready. Nadia photographed every document with the disposable camera she had bought at the drugstore 2 blocks from the motel. She photographed the church record 3 times from different angles. She put everything back in the fireproof box, locked it, and carried it with her. She left the other things in the unit. She would deal with them later. Right now she had what she needed. On the bus back to Cresswell, she held the box in her lap. Outside the window, the landscape unreeled itself in the flat, disinterested way of highway travel. And she thought about Reginald Ambrose Voss, born 1899, who had lived 88 years without children, who had watched his family fracture along lines of money and resentment, who had written a trust instrument so specific and so eccentric that it had held for over 30 years against 3 attempts, and would now, finally, reach the person he had somehow known would need it. She did not believe in the supernatural. She believed in something adjacent to it, the persistence of intent. The way a decision made by a person could survive them, could ripple forward through time, could find its target years or decades after the person who made it was gone. Her grandmother had made that kind of decision. Reginald had made that kind of decision. They had sent things forward into the future, and the future had received them. She thought about the tree, dead for years, bark gone gray, roots buckled, still standing. She thought about herself. She got back to Cresswell at 4:30 in the afternoon. She went directly to Harwell's office. Marcus was still there, sweater and all, and he let her into Harwell's office without making her wait, which was either efficiency or the particular awareness that what she was carrying was time-sensitive. She spread the photographs on his desk. He studied them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up, and for the first time since she had walked into his office, something that was not professional neutrality crossed his face. It was something older and quieter than surprise. It was the face of someone who has waited a long time for a thing they weren't sure would ever happen. The Raymond Voss connection, he said, puts you in the direct collateral line. Great-grandniece of Reginald. It's well within the trust's definition of Voss issue. He looked at the church record. This document alone is likely sufficient if we can get a notarized copy made. She said, what do we do now? He said, I make some calls. There's a family law attorney in this city I trust. Her name is Patricia Osei, and she's the best person I know for something like this. I'll call her tonight. Tomorrow you'll meet with her. She said, what does it cost? He said, the trust pays for it. That's in the instrument. Reginald was thorough. She looked at the photographs spread across his desk. At Iris's name. At Reginald's name. At the chain of baptisms and marriages going back 100 years. She said, how long before the family finds out? Harwell was quiet for a moment. I have a legal obligation to notify the known parties when a claim is filed. Once I file the claim, which I'll do when the documentation is ready, they'll have 30 days to respond. He paused. I would expect them to respond considerably faster than that. She said, who are they? He opened the folder to a section she hadn't seen before. A page with names, addresses, a brief notation next to each. 7 names. 3 in this state. 2 in neighboring states. 2 more distant. The oldest was a man named William Voss-Hartley, 71, who lived 40 miles east of Cresswell. She looked at the page. She thought, 40 miles. He's been the primary challenger, Harwell said. He's filed 3 motions against the trust instrument. All denied. But he has resources and he has history with this office. What kind of person is he? She asked. Harwell considered his words. He's a man who was told from a young age that he had an inheritance coming, and has spent his adult life operating on that assumption. He paused. He's not a bad man. He's a person who believes a thing is his and has built himself around that belief. When that belief is corrected, the correction feels like theft, even when the correct thing was never theirs. She looked at the page with William Voss-Hartley's address. She thought about what it would feel like to believe you were entitled to something your whole life, and then have it go to a woman you'd never heard of who had found an envelope on a dead tree. She thought about it carefully. She thought it would feel like the worst thing that had ever happened. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not guilt. She had done nothing wrong, but a kind of weight, the specific gravity of causing pain you didn't seek to cause, the way a river doesn't intend to wear down the canyon, but does. She said, I'd like to meet him eventually. Harwell looked at her. She said, not now. Not when it's adversarial. But when it's finished. When it's settled. I'd like to understand who he is. He was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is a more generous impulse than most people would have in your position. She thought about Iris. About soup that was mostly broth. About pride that didn't ask for things. She said, my grandmother was a generous person. I learned it from her. She walked back to the Haverford Motel through the early dark of an October evening. The streetlights were coming on, pools of yellow on gray sidewalk, and the air had the particular sharpness of a season changing, cold coming in underneath the residual warmth of the day. She passed a restaurant with its windows lit and people inside at tables, and she looked at them the way she had looked at people coming in and out of the library the night she had sat in the parking lot making phone calls. Except this time she did not want to hate them. This time she thought, rooms I haven't been in yet. She stopped at the corner of Clement and 4th and stood for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky, the last of the light caught in the high clouds. She thought about the estate. She had not yet seen it, had only imagined it from the letter's description, and from the county records she had looked up at the library, which gave dimensions and legal boundaries and a general parcel description, but nothing of how it looked in the actual world. Tomorrow she had a meeting with Patricia O'Shea. After that, she would ask Harwell if she could go to the property. She thought, I want to see the tree from the other side. The dead tree that had held the envelope was on the eastern boundary of the Ridgemont Road property, which meant it was on the edge of the Voss land, and she had been standing on the outside of it. She wanted to stand on the inside. She wanted to walk from that tree into whatever was on the other side of that rusted wire fence, into the 412 acres that waited at the end of a chain of paperwork and family dispute and a trust instrument written by a careful lawyer for an eccentric old man who had faith in the right angle. She would see it soon. She went back to the motel. She ordered a pizza with $20 of the $40 that remained, which was the first time in 14 months she had ordered food to be delivered to an address that was her own, temporary as it was. She sat on the bed and ate it and watched the television, which she turned on for the first time, not to watch anything specific, but for the company of noise, the particular comfort of a world going on in the room with you. She fell asleep with the television still on. She did not dream about the tree. She dreamed about Iris. They were eating soup, and it was good soup, the real kind, the kind that took hours to make, and Iris looked at her across the table and said something Nadia couldn't quite hear. She leaned forward to hear it. The dream shifted. Iris was gone, and the bowl was empty, and the room was full of morning light. She woke up. She lay for a moment in the blue-covered bed. Then she said out loud to no one in particular, I know, Iris. I'm being careful. She got up. She was ready for day 2. Patricia O'Shea's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a textile company and still smelled faintly of machine oil and old wood in the way buildings carry their histories in the walls long after the industry is gone. The elevator was slow and the hallway was narrow, and the frosted glass on her door said O'Shea Law in plain block letters with nothing else underneath, which Nadia later understood was intentional. Patricia O'Shea did not need to advertise. She was 51, compact and precise in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago which things were worth energy and which were not. She wore her hair natural and short, and she had reading glasses on a beaded chain and a desk, so clean it looked like she had just moved in, except the bookshelves behind her were so densely packed they seemed structural, like they were holding the wall up. She stood when Nadia came in and shook her hand and said, sit down, and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, and then sat across from her and said, David Harwell called me last night and told me everything he knows, which means I have the outline. I'd like to hear it from you. So Nadia told her. She told her from the beginning, from the drainage ditch to the dead tree to the envelope to the underpass and the candle and the list. She told her about the bus to Millhaven and the storage unit and the fireproof box and Iris's name on the church record next to Raymond Voss's. She told it in order, without editorializing, the way her grandmother had taught her to tell things. Start at the start and stop at the stop and let the facts carry the weight. Patricia listened without interrupting. She made notes on a legal pad. When Nadia finished, Patricia looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. You said you made a list the first night. Yes. What was on it? Nadia told her. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly. The kind of shift that means you've confirmed something you were already thinking. Okay, she said. Here's what you need to understand about the situation you're in. She turned the legal pad around and drew a line down the middle. On the left side, she wrote, what the trust says. On the right, what the family will argue. What the trust says is clear, she said. Bearer of the original deed, demonstrable Voss lineage, presented to Caraway and Associates. You satisfy all 3 conditions. The trust instrument is 37 years old, has survived 3 prior legal challenges, and the court has upheld its validity each time. She tapped the left side of the page. This is your ground, and it's solid. She tapped the right side. What the family will argue is that you found the deed through means that undermine the spirit of the instrument. They will say the tree was on private property and you were trespassing. They will say the deed had been deliberately hidden and not publicly accessible. They will say the lineage documentation has gaps, and that your grandmother's departure from the Voss name constitutes an effective severing of the bloodline in terms of the trust's intent. She paused. None of these arguments have legal merit. I want to say that clearly. But they don't need legal merit in the first instance. They need enough substance to get a judge to grant a temporary injunction on the transfer while the challenges are heard. If they get an injunction, the process slows to 12-18 months. During that time, you live on the stipend, which is not nothing, but is not the estate. Nadia said, "How do we prevent the injunction?" Patricia said, "We file first. Before they know you exist, we begin the formal lineage verification through independent genealogical analysis. We get the church record notarized and authenticated. We file a notice of claim with the trust and simultaneously with the county property office. We get ahead of them on every document so that by the time their lawyer is making phone calls, we've already answered the questions the judge will ask. How long does that take? If I work this weekend, which I will, and if the genealogical service I use can turn the authentication in 5 days, which they can, we file by next Thursday." Nadia did the math. Thursday was 9 days from now. She said, "How much do the genealogical services cost?" Patricia said, "It comes out of the trust's legal provision. Same as my fees." Reginald was very thorough. That was the second time someone had said that about Reginald Voss. She was beginning to build a picture of him from the things people said, the way you built a picture of someone you'd never met from the evidence they left behind. A man who was thorough. A man who watched his family fracture and decided to do something eccentric and specific about it. A man who had lived to 88 and left an envelope on a tree. She said, "Tell me about William Voss-Hartley." Patricia set down her pen. She said, "I've encountered him through the prior challenges. He retained counsel for all three, a firm out of the state capital, expensive and capable. He has significant resources. His father was one of Reginald's nephews, a man named George Hartley who married into the Voss name and hyphenated. William grew up being told the estate was the family's rightful inheritance and that the trust instrument was a product of Reginald's eccentricity and declining mental capacity. Was Reginald's capacity declining? No. She said it flatly. Emmett Carraway documented his client's mental acuity extensively during the drafting of the trust. There are 17 pages of notes from their sessions. Reginald was precise, specific, and fully oriented. He knew exactly what he was doing. The mental capacity argument was the first thing William's lawyers tried in 2001, and the court dismissed it in 3 weeks. Nadia thought about the letter, the careful penmanship, the specific logic of the conditions. The line about the right person for any task not always being the loudest or most connected. That was not the writing of someone whose mind was failing. That was the writing of someone who had thought very hard about something for a long time. She said, "When William finds out about me, what's his first move?" Patricia considered. "His first move will be to discredit you. Not the document, because the document is bulletproof. You. He'll look for anything in your background that suggests instability or bad faith. He'll look at the time you've been on the street. He'll look for criminal record." She paused. "Do you have one?" "No." "Any involvement with law enforcement that didn't result in charges?" She thought. Once, 2 years ago, she had been questioned by a police officer who had found her sleeping in a park in a city 3 hours from here. She had been released without any action being taken because sleeping in a park was not a crime in that jurisdiction, and she had been polite and cooperative and had a clean record. The officer had taken her name. She told Patricia. Patricia made a note. "That won't be an issue," she said. She paused. "He'll also try to find people who will testify that you're an opportunist, that you somehow manufactured or obtained the document rather than finding it." How would he argue that? He'll argue that you had knowledge of the trust's existence before you found the envelope, that you went looking for it deliberately. Did she? She said, "I had never heard of Reginald Voss before I read his letter. I had never heard of the trust. I didn't know the property existed. I knew my grandmother mentioned the Voss name once when I was 9, and I filed it away and forgot it." Patricia looked at her steadily. "Can you prove you didn't know?" She thought about this. "The 11 days in the drainage ditch are documented," she said. "The church shelter in Millhaven has records of when I was there and when I was turned away for space. The Gerald situation," she said the name with a particular flatness. "He'll be findable. Before that, the plant in Coburg. I've been visible enough that someone determined could trace my movements for the past 2 years without finding a single connection to anything related to Voss or this county or this property. Patricia made more notes. Good, she said. That's good. She looked up. I have one more question, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. She waited. When you found the envelope, she said, and you understood what it was, before you came to this office, what did you do? She said, I stayed in an underpass for 2 days. I went to the library and read about estate law and perpetual trusts. I looked up the address. I looked up the county records to confirm the property existed. Then I came here. Did you tell anyone? No. Did you make any calls about it? Send any messages? No. I don't have a phone. I used the library computers. I wasn't logged into any account. Patricia sat back. She said, You are either very composed or very experienced at being careful. She said both. Patricia smiled. It was a brief smile, the kind that acknowledged something specific. She said, Then here is what I'll need from you for the next 9 days. Stay at the Haverford. Don't talk about this to anyone. Don't look at anything related to this on the library computers using a guest login, because those logs are subpoenable. Don't contact any member of the Voss family or anyone adjacent to them. Don't speak to any journalist or anyone who identifies themselves as doing research about local families or estate law. She paused. Can you do that? She said yes. Patricia said, I believe you. She picked up her pen again. There's one more thing. The estate is currently being managed by a property services company contracted through the trust. They maintain the grounds, handle basic upkeep, do annual inspections. David has already notified them that a claim has been filed and that access should be granted to the claimant for a preliminary viewing. She looked at Nadia. You can go see it this week if you want. I'd recommend it. Whatever that property means to you on paper will change once you've walked it. She said, I want to go tomorrow. Patricia said, I'll arrange it. She did. The property services man who met her at the gate on Ridgemont Road the following morning was named Leon, and he was the kind of man who communicated primarily through function, showing her where to step, which gate to use, pointing out the soft ground near the pond without explaining why it was soft. He had a clipboard and a set of keys and a truck with a company logo on the door, and he was clearly accustomed to visiting a property where no one lived, going through the motions of maintenance and leaving, and the presence of a person who was looking at everything with intention made him slightly uncertain in the way people are uncertain when a routine changes. She paid no attention to his uncertainty. She was looking at the land. The gate was set back from the road by a gravel drive that had been overtaken at the edges by grass, and beyond the gate the drive continued up a gentle rise before turning south toward the main house. The property was not flat. It rolled in the way that hill country rolls, with intention, the land deciding where it wanted to be and the human structures arranged in conversation with that decision rather than against it. She stood at the top of the rise for a moment. She could see most of it from there. The main house was a large stone and timber structure, 2 stories, with a wide covered porch along the front and a chimney at each end. The stone was the local gray limestone that the county was built from, quarried and laid by someone who had understood that the point of stone was permanence. The timber was dark, weathered, the color of wood that has been outside long enough to become part of the landscape. The windows were intact, all of them, which surprised her, given the years of vacancy. The roof had a patch on the east end that was obviously newer than the rest, one of the trust's maintenance interventions. The 3 outbuildings were to the south and east. A large barn-style structure that was probably the original working barn, a smaller building that might have been a workshop or a smokehouse, and a third that was partly collapsed on one side, but whose foundation was clearly sound. Between the main house and the barn, a kitchen garden had been allowed to go mostly wild, but the bones of it were visible, raised beds, and a central path and a trellis where something had once climbed and still tried to. The woody stems of an old climbing rose reaching up through its own abandonment. East of the main house, past a stand of old oaks, the pond caught the morning light and threw it back at a low angle, the kind of light that made the water look like hammered silver. There was no dock, but there was a flat stone at the water's edge, big enough to stand on, worn smooth at the center in the way stones get worn by the repeated presence of someone who stood there often. She walked to it. She stood on it. She looked at the water. From this angle, she could see the far edge of the property, where the timber stand began, the taller pines rising above the oaks in a solid dark line. Beyond that, the hill country continued, the blue distance of ridges she didn't know the names of yet, the particular depth of a landscape that went on past what you could see. She stood there for a long time. Leon waited at a respectful distance, clipboard tucked under his arm, not looking at her. She thought about Iris. She thought about Reginald, born 1899, who had lived here for most of his adult life, who had built or inherited this stone and timber house, and this pond, and this timber stand, who had watched his family come and go and fracture, who had sat at the end of his life thinking about what should come next. She thought about the dead tree at the eastern boundary and realized that from where she was standing, she could see the fence line, the rusted wire, and just at the edge of her vision, the shape of the dead tree rising above the fence, gray and bare and still standing. She was on the inside now. Leon coughed softly, and she turned. He said, "The house is unlocked if you want to go through it. They told me to give you the full tour." She said, "Show me the house." The inside of Voss Grange smelled like cold stone and old wood, and the specific neutral smell of a place that has been maintained without being inhabited, cleaned at intervals, but not lived in, the way a museum smells before it opens in the morning. The floors were wide plank hardwood, dark with age, solid underfoot. The ceilings in the main rooms were high, crossed by timber beams that were original to the structure, still tight in their joints. The main room had a fireplace large enough to stand in, built from the same limestone as the exterior walls, with a mantel of dark timber and an iron fireback and a hearth swept clean by someone who came and swept it with the same indifferent thoroughness as all the other maintenance tasks. Above the mantel, faint discoloration in the plaster showed where something had hung for many years and been removed, a painting or a large photograph, its ghost remaining in the shape of unfaded plaster. She stood in front of the empty mantel. She thought, things were taken from here. Things that made this a home rather than a house. Reginald's things, removed after his death, distributed or stored or sold. The personal objects that hold a life in place after the person is gone. She thought, I will fill this room again. Not with his things. With mine. Whatever mine becomes. The kitchen was at the back of the house, large and well-proportioned, with north-facing windows that kept it cool. There was a cast-iron range, original to the house, and a deep stone sink and shelving that someone had built into the wall with considerable skill, the kind of shelving made to last rather than made to impress. The shelves were empty except for a single jar, old glass, with a faded label that she couldn't read from the doorway. She crossed to it. The label said, in Iris-era looped handwriting that made her breath catch, September preserves. She picked up the jar. The seal was intact. Whatever was inside had probably not survived 37 years. But the jar itself was perfect, the glass thick and old-fashioned, the metal lid still flat and unrusted. She set it back on the shelf. She stood in Reginald's kitchen with her hands at her sides and looked out the north window at the kitchen garden going wild in the October morning, the rose climbing its trellis, the beds with their bones of order underneath the overgrowth. She thought, this is real, not the number. The number was still abstract, still a figure on a page that her mind couldn't entirely hold. But this was real. The jar, the shelf, the window, the light coming through at an angle that made the stone floor glow the particular warm gray of old limestone in morning sun. This was the thing that had been waiting. She went through the rest of the house room by room, with Leon following at a distance, his clipboard forgotten under his arm. The 4 bedrooms upstairs, each with windows looking out onto different aspects of the property. The bathroom that had been plumbed in the 1940s and updated once since, functional and plain. A study at the end of the upper hall where built-in shelves still held books, real books, left behind because whoever cleared the house had not thought them worth taking or had known they belonged to the place. She looked at the spines. History, agriculture, natural science. A complete set of encyclopedias from the 1950s. A shelf of novels, older, the spines cracked with reading, and one book separate from the others, laid flat on the shelf rather than standing, a slim volume with a plain cloth cover. She picked it up. It was a journal. Inside the front cover, in the same careful hand as the letter on the dead tree, R. A. Voss. Private record. 1982. She stood at the shelf with the journal in her hands. She looked at Leon. He was looking out the window. She opened the journal to the first page. January 4th. Woke early to ice on the pond. The kind of morning that makes the world precise. Every edge sharp. Every line clear. I have been thinking about what comes after me. Not for the first time. But today with a clarity I haven't had before. The family does not deserve this land. That is a hard thing to write. These are blood of my blood. But blood is not character, and character is what the land deserves. She closed the journal. She put it in her jacket. She would read the rest of it somewhere warm, somewhere private, somewhere she could take the time it deserved. Leon led her back down to the main floor, through the kitchen, out to the grounds. He showed her the barn, which was structurally sound and vast inside, built for a working agricultural operation that had wound down in Reginald's later years. He showed her the workshop building, which still held some of Reginald's tools, left because they were too heavy to take and too specific to sell, a lathe and a workbench and a set of hand planes hanging on a pegboard in order of size. She stopped at the workbench. She ran her fingers along the edge. The wood was worn smooth at the place where hands would have rested repeatedly. This was the particular wear of use, of genuine work, of someone spending hours at a bench making things. She thought about what a workbench meant, that Reginald had made things with his hands, that the man who had written that trust instrument with such precision had also stood at a bench and planed wood and fit joints and built objects that required patience and care. She thought, we have that in common. She thought it, and it surprised her, and then it didn't. Leon walked her to the edge of the timber stand. The pines were old, 40 years at least, some taller, the ground beneath them carpeted with needles and quiet with the particular quiet of dense forest. The trust had contracted selective harvesting over the years, which was where a portion of the revenue came from. But the stand itself was intact, managed, healthy. She looked up through the pines at the sky. She said to Leon, "What do you know about this property?" He looked at her, deciding something. He said, "I've been doing maintenance here for 19 years. Quarterly visits since 2005. He paused. "It's a good property. They don't make them like this anymore. The stone on that house is set so tight you could pour water on it, and it'd still be dry inside." He was quiet for a moment. Reginald knew what he was doing when he built it. She said, "Did you know Reginald?" Leon shook his head. "He died in '87, before my time. But the people who trained me said he was a particular man, had opinions about how things ought to be done." She paused. In a good way, they meant. She thought about particular. She thought about thorough. She thought about an 88-year-old man who had nailed an envelope to a tree and trusted the universe to deliver it to the right person. She said, "I'm going to need help when the time comes. With the property, getting it back into working order." Leon looked at her, reading something in her face. He said, "I'll be here." She drove back to Cresswell in the car she had borrowed from Marcus, who had offered it that morning without her asking, in the understated way that Marcus did most things, as if offering the car of an attorney's assistant to a woman who was the prospective owner of a $400 million estate was an entirely routine part of his Thursday. She went directly to the motel. She sat on the bed. She opened the journal. She read it for 3 hours. Reginald Voss had written in it every few days from January through October of 1982, which meant it covered only 10 months of his 83 years. But those 10 months were full. He wrote about the property in the specific way of someone who knows every square foot of a piece of land and has opinions about each. He wrote about the timber stand and the pond levels and the way the kitchen garden performed in a dry summer. He wrote about the family, obliquely, with a restraint that read more clearly than anger would have. One nephew had asked about the will. Reginald had declined to discuss it. A cousin had visited twice in a single month, both times convenient to nothing except the continued curiosity about what the old man intended to do with his land and his money. He wrote about being alone, not with self-pity, with the same precision he brought to everything else. He wrote, "The solitude here has a quality to it I haven't found words for. It's not loneliness. Loneliness requires the absence of something you expected. I stopped expecting company years ago. What I have instead is an acute awareness of the land, the way a person learns a language through immersion. I know this property the way I know my own body, its aches and its strengths, where it needs attention and where it's fine on its own." She read that passage twice. She thought about the drainage ditch, about the acute awareness of concrete and cold water and the sound of traffic overhead, about the way you learned a place when it was all you had. She thought, "We are not so different, Reginald." She was halfway through October when she found the entry that made her stop. October 17th. Walked the eastern boundary this afternoon. The dead elm at the fence line is going gray. It will be gone in a few years, I expect. I've been thinking about it. Not as a landmark, but as something more. A marker. Thomas thinks I'm being sentimental. Thomas is probably right. But there is something to the idea of leaving a message in a place that most people won't think to look. Not hidden, just overlooked. The right person will look. The right person always looks at the things other people pass. She sat still. The dead elm. Not a tree that had died randomly, by disease or lightning or age. A tree that Reginald had been watching, had been thinking about, 5 years before he wrote the letter, before he prepared the trust instrument, before he told Thomas Carroway to put that envelope in waxed cloth and nail it to the dead elm at the fence line. He had seen it going gray in 1982, and he had thought, that is where I will leave it. He had watched it and waited, and when the time was right, he had nailed an envelope to a dead tree and trusted that the world would do the rest. She held the journal and felt the weight of 37 years. She thought, I am the thing you trusted the world to do. She read the rest of the journal that night, all the way through to the final entry in October, which was brief. October 31st. First frost. The pond has a skin of ice this morning, thin and clear. I stood at the edge and watched the ice form. There is a particular peace in watching natural processes complete themselves, things becoming what they are meant to become, in their own time, at their own pace, without hurrying. Without hurrying. She closed the journal. She lay on the bed with it on her chest and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of what she was inside. Not the money, the story, the chain of intention and time and specificity that had started with a man watching a tree go gray in 1982 and ended with a woman in a drainage ditch who looked at things from odd angles. She said, out loud, I found your tree. The ceiling did not answer. But the room felt different after that, the way rooms feel when you've said something that needed saying. She slept. The call came 8 days later. She was sitting in Patricia Osei's office going over the Lineage documentation when Patricia's phone rang. She took it, listened for 30 seconds, and said, thank you for letting me know. She hung up. She looked at Nadia. She said, William Voss-Hartley knows about you. His lawyers filed a notice of intent to challenge this morning. Nadia said, we filed first? Patricia said, we filed 4 days ago. We're already on record. She paused. But they move fast. His firm has a motion for preliminary injunction on the transfer scheduled for next Tuesday. That was 6 days away. Nadia said, what do we need for Tuesday? Patricia was already pulling folders. Everything we have and more, she said. The church lineage record. The genealogical authentication, which came back Thursday and is solid. The notarized copies of your grandmother's documents. The affidavit from David Harwell regarding the state of the original envelope's wax seal. And your testimony. She said, my testimony. Patricia looked at her. She said, you will need to stand up in front of a judge and tell this story. The drainage ditch, the tree, the candle in the underpass, all of it. Not because the law requires your life story. Because William's lawyers will paint you as an opportunist who found out about the trust and engineered a discovery. Your testimony, given truthfully and specifically, is your best counter to that argument. She paused. Are you comfortable with that? She thought about being asked if she was comfortable, about the variety of uncomfortable things she had done in the past 2 years and the years before that, by necessity rather than choice, and about the difference between uncomfortable by necessity and uncomfortable for a reason you chose. She said, I'm comfortable. Patricia said, good. She slid a folder across the desk. Read this tonight. It's a summary of the prior challenges and what arguments William's lawyers used. I want you to understand what's coming so none of it surprises you. She took the folder back to the motel. She read it that night. The prior challenges were what Patricia had described. Mental capacity, argued in 2001, dismissed in 3 weeks. Undue influence by Carroway over his client, argued in 2014, dismissed in 6. Most recently, in 2019, an argument that the bearer deed mechanism was an invalid instrument under current state property law, dismissed after 4 months. Each time, the court had upheld Reginald's trust as written, but each challenge had cost money and time. And each challenge, the documentation showed, had been mounted by William Voss-Hartley personally, retaining and funding counsel from his own resources. 3 times over 22 years. 3 times he had gone to court. 3 times he had lost. She thought about what that looked like from the inside. A man who had been told his whole life that something was coming, who had watched it reseed 3 times, who now faced a 4th challenge with a claimant who had better lineage than any of the previous 3 who had tried. She thought, he has to be exhausted. She read his deposition from the 2019 case. He had been 66 in 2019. The deposition transcript was 40 pages. He had been precise and organized and had not once lost his composure, which she recognized as a thing that took either practice or extraordinary self-control, or both. When the opposing attorney had asked him why he continued to pursue a claim that had failed 3 times, he had paused for what the transcript marked as a significant silence, and then he had said, "Because it was supposed to be ours. That's not arrogance. That's history. My father told me. His father told him. It goes back. And you don't just stop because a court says no. You stop when the truth changes." She had read that passage and sat with it. She understood it better than she wanted to. The specific faith in something coming that had been promised. The way that faith could outlast reason, could outlast evidence, could outlast 3 court dismissals over 22 years. It was not a rational thing. It was the kind of thing that lived below reason, in the part of a person that was formed before they were old enough to question it. She had not had that kind of faith growing up. She had not been given promises of inheritance or legacy or something coming. She had been given soup that was mostly broth and practical shoes, and the Voss blood is proud. She was beginning to understand that those were the same thing, differently delivered. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, the sky the particular color of something about to happen that hasn't decided what yet. She wore the best clothes she had, which were not particularly good but were clean and pressed by the motel iron. Patricia had offered to buy her something suitable, and she had said no, once, clearly, and Patricia had said fine and had not offered again, which was correct. The courthouse was a solid limestone building on the center of Cresswell's downtown square, 4 stories, with broad steps and the kind of institutional gravity that courthouses cultivate deliberately because the gravity is part of the function. She climbed the steps with Patricia beside her and David Harwell behind, and she felt none of the things she might have expected to feel. Not fear, not awe, not the weight of the building or the occasion. She felt clear. The courtroom was not large. Judge Sylvia Mather was 60, with gray hair and reading glasses and the expression of someone who had heard every possible version of people's claims on each other and had developed through long exposure a particular patience for the gap between what people said and what they meant. William Voss-Hartley was already seated at the opposing table. She had not seen a photograph of him. She had read his deposition and the prior challenge records and Patricia's description, and she had built a version of him in her mind that was not quite what sat across the room. He was large, broad through the shoulders, with white hair and a face that bore the specific lines of a person who had been outdoors in all weather for many decades. He wore a dark suit that sat on him like a uniform. He was not looking at her. His lawyers were 2, a man and a woman from the capital firm, polished and organized in the way of people who charged by the increment. She sat beside Patricia. Patricia set her shoulders on the table with quiet precision. Judge Mather called the session to order. William's lawyer spoke first, a motion for preliminary injunction pending a full hearing on the validity of the claim. He was good. She would give him that. He laid out his argument clearly and without waste, hitting 3 main points. The inadequacy of the documentary lineage evidence, the irregular nature of the instrument's delivery mechanism, and what he called the implausibility of the claimed discovery, which was his way of suggesting, without quite accusing, that she had known about the trust before she found the envelope. She watched him while he spoke. She watched the judge. Judge Mather listened with her hands flat on the desk, making no notes, which she would later learn meant the judge had already read everything and was listening for what the words didn't say. Patricia responded. She was not good. She was precise. There was a difference. Goodness in an attorney was about presentation, about performance, about the jury-facing skill of making an argument land in an emotionally resonant way. Precision was something else. It was the ability to cut to the structural center of a legal question and answer it there, without decoration, without theatrics, in a way that left no purchase for counterargument, because the counterargument had already been anticipated and closed off. Patricia laid out the genealogical authentication. She presented the church record with the independent verification from 2 genealogists. She presented the timeline of Nadia's movements for the 2 years prior to the discovery, documented through shelter records, employment records, and the affidavits of 3 individuals who had interacted with her during that period and could confirm her presence in locations entirely unrelated to Cresswell or the Voss estate. She said to the judge, the claimant was sleeping in a drainage ditch on Ridgemont Road when she found this envelope. This is not the operating pattern of a sophisticated fraudster. This is a person who was, in the most literal sense, in the right place at the right time. William's lawyer objected to characterizations. Judge Mather sustained it with a single word and asked Patricia to continue. Patricia continued. Then the judge looked at Nadia. She said, Ms. Beaumont, I'd like to hear from you directly. Would you tell me, in your own words, how you came to find this document? She stood. She told it the same way she had told it to Patricia. From the beginning. From the drainage ditch and the 11 days, and the particular angle at which she had been standing when she noticed the corner of waxed cloth showing beneath the bark. She told it without embellishment, and without apology, and without the kind of performed emotion that asks the listener to feel rather than understand. She said, I had never heard of Reginald Voss before I read his letter. I did not know this property existed. I did not know my grandmother's family connection to the Voss name beyond a single comment she made when I was 9 years old, which I did not fully understand at the time and had not revisited before that night. I found an envelope on a tree because I was standing at the right angle, and I pay attention to things other people walk past. I don't know why I pay attention that way. I think it's the kind of person I am. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Judge Mather looked at her for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when someone with judicial authority is looking at you. Then she looked at William Voss-Hartley. She said, Mr. Voss-Hartley, I've reviewed the prior challenge records in this case. I've looked at the 2001 and 2014 and 2019 proceedings. I see a consistent pattern of well-funded legal challenge against a trust instrument that has been upheld 3 times on its merits. She paused. I'm not unsympathetic to your position. I want to be clear about that. But I'm also not sympathetic to the use of legal process to delay what the court has repeatedly found to be a valid instrument simply because the specific bearer of the deed is not the bearer your family anticipated. She looked at both sides. She said, I'm going to deny the motion for preliminary injunction. The claim will proceed to a full verification hearing, which I'm scheduling for 60 days from today. At that hearing, the lineage documentation will be formally admitted and the parties will have full opportunity to present their cases. Until then, the transfer is stayed, which is the only concession I'll make to the challenging party's interest. She looked at William's lawyers. If you intend to mount a challenge on the merits, bring something I haven't seen before. The 3 prior challenges failed because the instrument is solid. If you're planning to run the same arguments a 4th time, save everyone's time and don't. She adjourned. Patricia put her hand briefly on Nadia's arm. Nadia looked across the room. William Voss-Hartley was talking to his lawyers in a low voice, his back to the room. One of the lawyers was taking notes. The other was looking at his phone. William himself was not doing anything frantic or dramatic. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening, and when his lawyer finished speaking, he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a person processing information rather than reacting to it. Then he turned. He looked at her. She looked back. It lasted only a few seconds. Then his lawyers moved, and the moment closed, and he was out the side door before she had fully registered what she had seen in his face, which was not anger, not contempt, not the triumphant calculation of someone planning a countermove. It was recognition, the specific look of someone seeing a thing they've been waiting for and having it be different than they imagined. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away. Outside on the courthouse steps, Patricia said, "That went well." She said, "The motion was denied, but we have 60 days until the full hearing." Patricia said, 60 days is enough. We have what we need. Unless they produce something genuinely new, and they won't, because there is nothing new to produce, we walk out of the hearing in 60 days with a transfer order. She said, "And then what?" Patricia looked at her. She said, "And then you own it." She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the limestone square of downtown Cresswell, the buildings and the trees and the cars moving around the perimeter, the ordinary particular world of a place going about its morning. She thought about the pond. She thought about the flat stone worn smooth by the repeated presence of Reginald Voss standing at the water's edge. She thought, I'm going to put a dock in. Not because I need one. Because a pond that size should have a dock. and a dock is a place to sit at a specific hour of morning and watch the light come off the water, and that was something she was going to do if it took her the rest of her life to do it. She walked back to Harwell's office with Patricia. She had a lot of work ahead of her. She was not in a hurry. The 60 days passed the way significant time passes, slowly at the day level and impossibly fast at the level of what needed doing. Patricia prepared the lineage documentation for formal court submission. The genealogical firm produced a 30-page report tracing the Voss family line from Reginald's grandfather forward through all the branches, mapping every marriage, every naming shift, every departure from the surname, including the specific chain that ran through Raymond Voss, to Iris Beaumont Voss, to Celia Beaumont, to Nadia Beaumont. The report was thorough. Reginald would have approved. William's lawyers submitted 2 motions during the 60 days. Patricia answered both within 48 hours. Neither motion reached the threshold for disrupting the scheduled hearing. She spent part of each week at the estate. Leon had given her a key, pending the formal transfer, on Harwell's authorization. She went on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, early, before the property services crew came for their scheduled maintenance. She walked the property the way you walked a thing you were learning, not to accomplish anything specific, but to accumulate detail, to build the kind of knowledge that only comes from repeated presence. She learned where the ground was soft near the pond's eastern edge and where it was firm. She learned which of the barn's roof joints flexed in wind and which were solid. She learned that the kitchen garden soil was extraordinary, dark and deep, worked for decades, and that underneath the overgrowth there was structure, a composting system, a drainage channel, a series of beds laid out with the kind of careful thought that suggested someone had read extensively about kitchen garden design before committing to the layout. Reginald again. She found his name in the most unexpected places. In the pegboard in the workshop where every tool had its specific outline painted in white so it could be returned to exactly the right position. In the shelving in the kitchen where the spacing between shelves was calibrated, she eventually realized, to the height of the specific kinds of jars he had used for preserving. In the way the stone path from the house to the pond curved slightly south to avoid a particular root system, suggesting he had designed the path around the tree rather than trimming the tree to accommodate the path. A man who worked with what was there rather than imposing on it. She thought about that while she read his journal for the 3rd time. She was rereading the October entries when she found the passage she had missed on the first 2 readings, because she had been tired both times, and the handwriting in October was smaller and more compressed than the January entries, as though Reginald's hand was tightening toward the end of the year. October 19th. Thomas asked me today if I was certain about the arrangement, whether I had considered what would happen if no one found the envelope for 10 years. 20. 50. I told him what I believe. The property will wait. Stone is patient. The trust will run. The revenue will accumulate. And when the right person finds it, they will find not just the land but the time that accumulated with it. A thing preserved is not a thing stagnant. It is a thing concentrated. I am leaving them not just an estate but 30 years, 40 years, however long it takes, of concentrated intention. That is the inheritance, not just the land. The waiting. She read the final sentence 3 times. The waiting. 37 years of a trust running. 37 years of mineral lease revenue and timber sales and property appreciation, compounding into a number that was now over 400 million. But also 37 years of the land sitting in patient suspension, being maintained and not loved, being kept and not inhabited, waiting for the person who would come. That was what she was inheriting. Not just 400 acres. 37 years of someone's faith. The weight of it was not crushing. It was the opposite. It was clarifying in the way that the morning at the pond was clarifying, when the light came off the water at that specific angle. It made the question of what she owed very simple. She owed the land its future. She owed Reginald's faith its completion. She did not owe the family her guilt. She had not taken anything from them. They had never had it. A man who built something and then thought hard about where it should go after him and decided it should go somewhere unexpected, that was not a betrayal of his blood. That was the exercise of the only real authority any of us have, which is what we do with the time and the things we were given. She thought, I understand you, Reginald. She thought, I will not waste it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January. The night before, she sat at the small desk in room 7 of the Haverford Motel, which she had been living in for 68 days, and she wrote in her own notebook. Not the list of tasks and practical questions she kept for daily navigation. A different kind of writing, the kind she rarely did because it required a stillness she was usually too busy surviving to find. She wrote about her grandmother, about the soup and the practical shoes, and the Voss blood is proud, about the state park and the lake and the summer she was 9, about the way Iris had told her hard things without making them harder, which was a skill Nadia had spent years trying to understand and was only now beginning to see fully. The skill of not adding weight, of saying the thing that needed saying, and then trusting the person in front of you to carry it. Iris had said, "The Voss blood is proud and doesn't ask for things." She had not said, "You are connected to something larger than what you can see." She had not said, "There is a trust instrument and a dead tree and an envelope that may one day change your life." She had just said, "Proud, stubborn, doesn't ask." And then she had trusted the 9-year-old across the table to carry it until she was ready for the rest. She wrote, "I was ready, Iris. I am ready." She put the notebook away. She went to sleep at a reasonable hour for the first time in a long time. In the morning, she put on the clean shirt and the shoes she had cleaned the same way she had cleaned them the first day she walked into Harwell's office. She picked up the fireproof box with Iris's documents. She walked to the courthouse. Patricia was already on the steps. She said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Concentrated." Patricia looked at her for a moment. She said, "Good. That's exactly right." They went inside. The courtroom was the same as before, same limestone walls, same high windows letting in the flat January light, same institutional quiet that courtrooms kept regardless of what was happening inside them. But it felt different to her this time. Not smaller, more specific, more real in the way that places become real through repeated presence rather than through their size or their age. She sat at the same table. Patricia beside her, organized and ready. David Harwell in the gallery, his presence a kind of ballast. William Voss-Hartley was already seated across the room. He was wearing the same dark suit, or one identical to it. His lawyers flanked him, the same two from the injunction hearing. Files open on the table in front of them, the architecture of a challenge assembled and ready. She looked at him. He was looking at his hands, folded on the table, the particular stillness of someone waiting for something they have been waiting for a very long time. She thought about the 2019 deposition, about the 40 pages, about the long pause before he answered, and what he had said, "You stop when the truth changes." She thought about whether, for William Voss-Hartley, today was going to be the day the truth changed. She thought it probably was. She had read his deposition 3 more times in the 60 days since the injunction hearing. Each time she had come away with the same feeling. Not sympathy exactly. Not guilt. Something more specific. The feeling of looking at a person who has spent a long time running toward a finish line that was never where they thought it was, and who had kept running anyway, because stopping was the one thing they did not know how to do. She knew something about that. She had been running toward things that turned out to be elsewhere for most of her adult life. The difference was that she had never been told the thing was coming. She had never been given the specific promise that had organized William's whole understanding of what was his. She thought, "He is going to lose today." She thought, "And I am going to have to figure out what to do with that." Judge Mather entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. She was ready. She had been ready since the morning she pulled a piece of waxed cloth off a dead tree and found an envelope addressed to no one in particular and understood, with the calm that comes after everything else is burned away, that it was meant for her. The truth was not something she had made happen. The truth was something she had found, because she had been paying attention when everyone else walked past. That was all she had done. That was everything. Judge Mather did not waste time. That was the first thing Nadia understood about her, watching her move through the morning's procedural opening. She had read everything submitted by both parties before she walked into the room, and she had organized her questions the way a person organized a workbench before beginning something precise. Every tool in its place, no motion wasted. When she asked about the genealogical authentication, she already knew the answer. She was verifying that the answer she had read matched the answer she was being given, which was a different kind of listening than most people did, and a more useful one. William's lawyers presented their case for 2 hours. They were good, as they had been at the injunction hearing. But Patricia had been right about one thing in the 60 days leading up to this. They did not have anything new. The 3 arguments they ran were variations on the 3 that had failed before, dressed in new language and supported by new documentation, but structurally identical. Mental acuity of the testator argued indirectly this time through questions about the instrument's unusual delivery mechanism rather than directly about Reginald's capacity. Validity of the bearer deed clause under current state law, and the one she had been expecting since the injunction hearing. The argument that Nadia's presence on Ridgemont Road at the time of the discovery was not the random proximity of a homeless person, but the calculated positioning of someone who had prior knowledge of the trust's existence. This last argument was the one they spent the most time on. William's lead lawyer, the man, was named Aldrich, and he was at his best here, building the case through implication rather than assertion, asking questions that assumed things he couldn't prove, and then letting the assumption sit in the air of the courtroom like something that had been spoken. He asked Patricia questions about Nadia's family background. He asked about the specific location of the drainage ditch relative to the property boundary. He asked, with a particular delicacy that was its own kind of aggression, whether Ms. Beaumont had any prior knowledge of the Voss family's connection to Creswell County through any source, including family oral history. Patricia objected 3 times. The judge sustained once and overruled twice. Then it was Patricia's turn. She did not try to out-imply Aldrich. She dismantled his implications the way you dismantled a structure, by removing the load-bearing pieces until the rest fell. She walked the court through Nadia's documented movements for the 26 months prior to the discovery. She entered the shelter records from Millhaven, the employment records from Coburg, the documentation from Gerald's former landlord, who had provided, through a notarized statement, the date on which Nadia had left the address in his name and not returned. She laid these in order, chronological, specific, and she said, "This is a woman in motion away from difficulty, not toward opportunity." The drainage ditch on Ridgemont Road was not a calculated position. It was the end of a sequence of events that had nothing to do with Voss or Creswell or any trust instrument. Then she called Nadia. She told it the same way she had told it at the injunction hearing. Steady, in order, without drama. The drainage ditch. The 11 days. The odd angle at which she'd been standing when she noticed the corner of waxed cloth. She held nothing back and added nothing, because nothing added would help her, and everything true already did. Aldrich cross-examined for 20 minutes. He was looking for inconsistency. He found none, because there was none to find. She had told the same story to Patricia, to Harwell, to the injunction hearing, and now to this courtroom, in the same order and with the same details, because it was what had happened, and what had happened did not change based on who was asking. At one point Aldrich said, with the careful mildness of someone delivering what they believe is a damaging question, "Isn't it true that your grandmother mentioned the Voss name to you as a child?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you retained that information?" She said, "I retained the word." The way children retain words that have weight without understanding the weight. I had no context for it. I didn't know there was an estate or a trust or a property. I knew my grandmother said we had Voss blood, and that Voss blood was proud. I was 9 years old. I thought she was talking about character. Aldrich paused. He said, "But you remembered it." She said, "I remember most things my grandmother told me. She died when I was 16, and she was the person who raised me. I remember everything she said." The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Aldrich had no follow-up. He sat down. Judge Mather made a note. Then she looked at both tables. She said, "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess, and then I'll deliver my ruling on the verification hearing." She looked at Aldrich. "I want to say something before we break. I've now presided over a case involving this trust instrument for the first time, but I've read the transcripts of the 3 prior challenges thoroughly. I am aware of the history. I am aware of the significant investment your client has made in those challenges over 22 years. None of that changes what the law requires me to do today. What the law requires is that I apply the instrument's conditions to the facts presented. I intend to do that." She rose. Everyone rose. She left. The 30 minutes passed in the particular suspended quality of time spent waiting for something that cannot be hurried. Patricia organized her folders with the efficiency of someone who had already decided the outcome. David Harwell came from the gallery to the table and spoke quietly about a procedural matter relating to the county property office filing. She listened and responded and noted what needed doing after and kept the bulk of her attention on the room. William Voss-Hartley sat at his table across the room. His lawyers were leaning in, speaking, and he was not speaking back. He was sitting with his hands on the table, very still, looking at the middle distance. The same stillness she had seen at the injunction hearing. The stillness of a man who had run a very long race and was at the final stretch and already knew what the finish line was going to say. She looked at him and felt the thing she had been carrying since she read his deposition. Not guilt. Something more careful than guilt. The awareness that her gain and his loss were not separate events. They were the same event, experienced from different positions. Reginald had made a decision that would enrich one person and disappoint another, and the disappointing of. William Voss-Hartley was not a side effect of Nadia finding the envelope. It was the central mechanism. Reginald had looked at his family and decided it should go elsewhere, and William was the specific consequence of that decision. The man who had organized his whole understanding of the future around a promise that had always been conditional on something he never controlled. She thought about what it cost to believe in something for 70 years. She thought, I owe him something. Not the estate, not an apology, but something. She was still thinking about what that something was when the judge returned. Judge Mather sat. She opened the folder in front of her. She said, I've reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties. The genealogical authentication presented by the claimant is thorough and independently verified. The lineage from Reginald Ambrose Voss through his brother Raymond to the claimant is established to a reasonable legal standard. The original deed, authenticated by David Harwell, who has served as trustee of the Reginald Voss Perpetual Trust since 2003, is the document specified in the instrument. She paused. The challenges raised by the opposing party are not without historical precedent, but they are not supported by the evidence presented in this hearing. The mental capacity argument fails on the same grounds it failed in 2001. The bearer deed validity argument fails on the same grounds it failed in 2019. And the argument regarding the claimant's prior knowledge of the trust is not supported by a single piece of evidence that rises above speculation. She looked at both tables. She said, the transfer of Voss Grange, comprising 412 acres with all structures and appurtenances as described in the trust instrument, from the Reginald Ambrose Voss Perpetual Trust to Nadia Elise Beaumont, great-grandniece of Reginald Ambrose Voss, is hereby approved. I'm directing the county property office to process the deed transfer within 30 days. The trust assets, including the accumulated revenue in the mineral lease account, will transfer to the claimant's designated account upon completion of the county filing. She removed her glasses. That's the ruling. Court is adjourned. She stood. Everyone stood. The gavel came down. Patricia put her hand on Nadia's arm, the same brief touch she had used at the injunction hearing, which was Patricia's way of marking a moment without turning it into a performance. Harwell said something that she didn't fully hear because there was a sound in her ears that was not external, the particular internal resonance of a large thing arriving, the way certain silences are louder than noise. She turned. William Voss-Hartley was standing at his table, not moving. His lawyers were packing their files. He was not packing anything. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and then he looked up and he looked at her. This time it lasted longer than a few seconds. She made a decision in that space. She said something to Patricia in a low voice. Patricia looked at her, assessed, and nodded once. She crossed the courtroom. She stopped in front of William Voss-Hartley. He was taller than she had registered at the distance of two opposing tables. Close up, the lines in his face were deep, the specific depth of outdoor weather and time, and a considerable amount of worry. His eyes were brown and clear, and he was looking at her with the expression she had identified at the injunction hearing, which was recognition, and which was now mixed with something she hadn't seen there before. Something that was not anger and was not defeat, though it contained elements of both. She said, I've read your 2019 deposition. He said nothing. She said, you said you'd stop when the truth changed. She paused. I want you to know that I understand what it costs to believe in something for as long as you've believed in this. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, who are you? She said, Iris Beaumont's granddaughter. Iris was Raymond Voss's daughter. She was a practical woman who raised me on soup and hard work and told me once that the Voss blood was proud. She died when I was 16. Something moved through his face. He said, I didn't know Raymond had a daughter. The family records didn't show it. She said, she married young and took her husband's name entirely. She didn't stay connected to the Voss side. I think she didn't know there was anything to stay connected to. Or if she knew, She didn't think it was hers to claim. He looked at her for a long time. He said, "You really didn't know?" She said, "I really didn't know." Another silence. He said, "Low," the kind of low that meant he was saying it to himself as much as to her. 37 years. She said, "Yes." She let that sit. Then she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it." He waited. She said, "Reginald built that property. He worked it his whole life. He left it to whoever found that envelope because he didn't trust anyone he knew to care for it the way it deserved." She paused. "I don't know what he saw in the family that made him that decision, but I think he saw something true, and I think you probably know what it was." William Voss-Hartley looked at her for a long time. He said, "My father went to see Reginald 6 months before he died. Went to ask him directly about the will, about the estate. He came back and told us everything was arranged. He said Reginald had as good as promised it to the family. He said all the legal details were sorted." He paused. "My father was not a dishonest man in most things, but he was very good at hearing what he wanted to hear." She said, "And you believed him?" He said, "I was 22. He was my father." She nodded. She said, "I'll make you a promise, not because the law requires it and not because I owe you anything, but because Reginald built something worth keeping and I intend to keep it, and keeping it right means understanding its full history." She looked at him directly. "I'm going to learn everything about that property, what it was, what Reginald intended for it, what it should become. When I have a clearer picture of that, I'd like to sit down with you, not your lawyers, you, and talk about what you remember about the family and the land and Reginald himself. Because you knew the family from the inside, and I'm coming at it from the outside, and both of those perspectives have things the other one doesn't." He stared at her. He said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because the truth is more complete when more people hold parts of it." His lawyers had stopped packing. They were watching this exchange with the particular alert stillness of professionals who were witnessing something outside their professional framework. William looked at his lawyers and back at her. He said, "My father said Reginald was the most stubborn man he ever met. Said once he decided something, the mountain moved before Reginald did." She said, "I've read his journal. I believe it." He said, "You have his journal." She said, "I found it in the study, on the shelves." He looked away for a moment, at the courtroom window, the January light coming through flat and cold. He said, "He had that journal for years. He wouldn't let anyone read it. Said a man's private thoughts were his business and nobody else's." She said, "They were his business. They still are, mostly. But some of what he wrote is the kind of thing that deserves to be known. Not because it changes anything legally, because it explains something." He said, "What does it explain?" She said, "Why he did it this way. Why the tree? Why the waiting?" She paused. He wasn't punishing the family. He was trying to find someone who looked at things from the right angle. William was silent. Then he said, quietly, "And you do?" She said, "Apparently." Something shifted in his face. Not resolution exactly. Not peace. But the beginning of something that might become peace, given enough time and enough honesty on both sides. He said, "I'll think about what you've said." She said, "That's all I'm asking." She put out her hand. He looked at it. He shook it. His lawyers looked at each other. She walked back across the courtroom to where Patricia was waiting with the contained expression of someone who had witnessed something unexpected and was deciding what to make of it. Harwell stood behind her with no expression at all, which was Harwell's version of being moved. Patricia said, quietly, "That was not in my playbook." She said, "I know." Patricia said, "It was the right thing." She said, "I know that too." They walked out of the courthouse into the January cold. The sky had cleared while they were inside, and the light was the particular brilliant flat light of winter, everything sharp-edged and precise under a sky that had stopped equivocating. She stood on the steps for a moment. Harwell came to stand beside her. He said, "Emmett would have liked this. All of it." She said, "Tell me about Emmett." He looked at her. She said, "You worked for him for 11 years before he died. You've been running his work for 20 more. He spent 17 years after Reginald died maintaining a trust he must have wondered would ever be claimed. I'd like to know who he was." Harwell was quiet for a moment. He said, "He was a man who kept promises. Simple as that. He made a commitment to Reginald in 1986, and he held it until the day he died, and then he passed it to me and asked me to hold it the same way." He paused. He used to say that the law was just a way of writing down what decent people already knew they ought to do. He said the problem was that not everyone was decent, so you needed the writing. She thought about that. She said, "He sounds like my grandmother." Harwell smiled. Small, real. Not a lawyer's smile. He said, "Then they would have understood each other." She said, "Probably." They walked down the steps together. The 30 days the county property office needed passed in the patient way of bureaucratic processes, each step requiring the previous one to be completed, each signature requiring a preceding signature, each filing requiring a preceding filing. The careful architecture of transfer that moved at its own pace regardless of what was happening in the lives it affected. During those 30 days, she made decisions. Not all of them had to do with the estate directly. Some had to do with who she was going to be inside the life that was arriving. She had spent 2 years in motion, moving away from things, navigating by what she needed to avoid, and now she had to learn to navigate towards something, which required a different kind of attention. Not the constant low-level alertness of survival, but the slower, more deliberate attention of building. She thought about buildings. She thought about the workshop in the outbuilding at Voss Grange, Reginald's lathe and workbench, the hand planes on the pegboard. She thought about the kitchen garden and its bones of careful design beneath the overgrowth. She thought about the timber stand and the pond and the stone house with its north-facing kitchen windows and the shelf with the jar of September preserves. She thought, all of this has been waiting. Now it gets to start. On the 23rd day, Patricia called her. She said, "The county office finished the filing this morning. The deed transfers formally tomorrow when the record is updated. You'll receive a call from Harwell with the account details for the mineral lease fund transfer." She said, "Thank you for everything." Patricia said, "It was a good case. Clean and clear, and with an ending worth having." She paused. "I don't get many of those." On the 24th day, Harwell called. He read her the account balance in the flat tone of someone delivering a number they had lived with long enough that its size no longer produced a physical reaction. She wrote it down in her notebook. She looked at it. She put the cap back on the pen. She said, "I need to set up a separate account for the estate's operating costs, a foundation account for the charitable work, and a personal account that's distinct from both." He said, "I'll connect you with the bank's private client division." She said, "I'd prefer to use the local branch on Clement Street. I've been using their ATM. They know my face." A pause. He said, "I'll call the branch manager." She said, "Thank you." On the 25th day, she went to the estate. She did not go with Leon or with Patricia or with Harwell. She drove the used car she had bought the previous week, a 12-year-old sedan in a color the lot had described as silver, but which was more accurately the color of old dishwater, and which ran cleanly and had good tires and cost $6,000 of the first month's stipend adjustment. And she drove alone up Ridgemont Road and turned in at the gate. She had a key. She had always had a key, since Leon had given her one during the 60 days of waiting. But this time the key meant something different. This time the lock it turned was hers. She parked at the top of the rise where you could see most of the property. She sat for a moment with the engine off. January on 400 acres was a particular kind of quiet. The timber stand was deep and dark at the property's eastern edge. The pond had a skin of ice at the margins, not thick enough to bear weight. Just the day's cold laid over the water's surface. The kitchen garden was brown and dormant and still. The stone house sat at the center of the property the way stone houses sit, like they grew there rather than being built, like the ground accepted them. She got out of the car. She walked to the house. She unlocked the front door. She stepped inside. The house smelled the same as it always had, cold stone and old wood, and the neutral maintenance smell underneath. But it felt different. The feeling was not large or dramatic. It was the feeling of a space registering a new presence and adjusting to it the way rooms adjust, not through any metaphysical mechanism, but through the simple physics of a person being somewhere and the somewhere responding. She walked through the main room. She stood at the fireplace. The discoloration above the mantel, the ghost of whatever large thing had hung there for years, was still there. She looked at it for a moment. She went to the kitchen. She put the kettle on the cast iron range. Leon had connected the gas last week, part of the pre-transfer preparation, and the range lit on the second match, the way old things light when they have been waiting long enough, with a gratitude that was not sentimental but was specific. While the kettle heated, she stood at the north window and looked at the kitchen garden. She thought about what it would look like in May, June, July. She thought about the soil, dark and deep, worked for decades, ready. She thought about the rows on the trellis, which was still alive under its dormancy, the woody stems holding the memory of bloom. She thought about what she would plant and when and in what order, the logic of a kitchen garden, which was a different kind of list than the one she usually made, not a list of problems and solutions, but a list of intentions arranged in time. The kettle whistled. She made tea. She took the cup to the main room and sat on the floor in front of the fireplace because there was no furniture yet, and she looked at the room, and she drank the tea. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Reginald sitting in this same room, in whatever chair had been in that spot, looking at the same fireplace, writing in his journal about the land and the family and the weight of deciding what should come next. She thought about the specific loneliness of a person who has outlived or outgrown everyone around them and finds themselves at the end of a life with the question of what it meant still open. She thought it meant something. It meant this. Not the estate, not the money, the decision, the trust, the envelope on the tree, the act of believing, in the face of all evidence that the world was not inclined toward that kind of faith, that the right person would come. She thought, Reginald, you were right. The afternoon light moved across the room while she sat there, the winter sun tracking its low arc and the shadows shifting on the stone floor in a way that was slow and deliberate, the kind of light movement you only noticed if you were still enough to watch it. She was still enough. She watched it. When the light had moved all the way to the east wall, she stood, rinsed her cup in the kitchen sink, and walked out to the car. She had a full list of things to do. The bank, the foundation paperwork, a conversation with a contractor about the collapsed wall of the third outbuilding, a conversation with Leon about the kitchen garden soil amendment needs for spring planting, a conversation with Patricia about the charitable structure she intended to build. She had read Reginald's journal 9 times now, different sections each time, and the entry she returned to most often was not the one about the tree. It was a shorter one, from March of 1982, when the journal was new and he was still finding his rhythm in it. March 3rd. The question I keep returning to is not what the land is worth, but what it is for. Worth and for are different questions, and most people stop at worth, which is the lesser question. Worth tells you what someone will pay. For tells you what something means. I have spent 40 years learning what this land is for. It is for the patient. It is for the attentive. It is for the person who will stand at the edge of the pond at a specific hour and watch the light and understand, without being told, that this is what land is. She had read that entry and understood something that the number in the account statement and the deed in her name and the judge's ruling had not fully communicated. That the inheritance was not a conclusion. It was an invitation into a particular way of being. Reginald had found that way of being through 88 years of living on the same land, learning it in the way you learned a language through immersion. She was going to have to find it differently, coming to it at 23 from a drainage ditch, but the destination was the same. Patient, attentive, present at the specific hour. She could do that. She had been doing a version of it her whole life without the land to do it on. 2 weeks after the formal transfer, she moved in. She did not bring much. The fireproof box, her notebook, the journal she had borrowed from the shelf and would return to the shelf when she was done with it. Except she was not done with it and was not sure she would be. The $4.37, which she had finally spent on a candle, a good one, beeswax, from a shop on the Cresswell Main Street that sold things made by local craftspeople, and which she had lit on the first night in the house and placed on the kitchen shelf next to the jar of September preserves. She slept in the master bedroom on a mattress she had bought with a portion of the first full monthly transfer, plain and good, and set directly on the hardwood floor because she had not bought a frame yet and was not in a hurry to. She lay in the dark on the first night and listened to the house. It had sounds. Old houses had sounds. The timber settling as the temperature dropped, a low and distant creak. The wind finding a gap somewhere near the east chimney and making a tone, low and intermittent, not a whistle, but something below a whistle, more like breath. A sound outside that was probably the rose on the trellis, the stems moving against the wood. She listened. She thought, this is mine. Not in the way of possession, in the way of belonging. The way a place and a person find each other. Sometimes through inheritance, and sometimes through purchase, and sometimes through the specific accident of being the person who stops at the right tree on the right morning. She slept. In March, she hired 3 people. A groundskeeper named Vera, who was 60 and had been gardening professionally in the county for 30 years, and who walked the kitchen garden on the day she came for her interview, and said only, "This soil is extraordinary. Someone took great care of it." And that was when Nadia knew she was right. A carpenter named Gil, who was 40-something and quiet and had been recommended by Leon, and who walked through the house and the outbuildings and said, at the end of the walkthrough, "The bones are exceptional. This'll be straightforward work," which was the kind of thing only a person who knew bones well could say. And a young woman named Sarah, 20, who had grown up on a farm outside Cresswell, and who came to work in the kitchen garden because she had read the job listing, which Nadia had written herself, and had written back that she had been looking for exactly this kind of work without knowing that this kind of work existed, which Nadia thought was a good sign. By April, the kitchen garden was turned and amended and beginning to show the first green of the season. Vera had been right about the soil. The things they put in came up fast and strong. The way things came up in ground that had been loved for a long time and remembered how. By May, Gil had repaired the third outbuilding and was working on the restoration of the barn's interior, rebuilding the lofting system that had rotted out, using timber from the property's own stand, which Harwell had confirmed was within the Trust's original guidelines for sustainable use. By June, Sarah had learned the kitchen garden's logic, had understood the rotation system Reginald had designed, and had begun expanding it south along the wall in a way that preserved the original structure and extended it naturally, the way a sentence extended when you understood the grammar of what had come before. In June, William Voss-Hartley called. He called on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden, pulling the first summer radishes, and she had a phone now, a real one, not the motel phone or a library line, and she sat on an overturned bucket in the middle of the garden and talked to him for 40 minutes. He asked about the house. She told him about the kitchen range and the north-facing windows and the shelf in the kitchen where Reginald had calibrated the spacing to his specific preserving jars. He was quiet for a moment after that. He said, "I remember those jars. I was at the house once when I was young, maybe 12. Reginald had the pantry full of them. He made everything himself. Preserves, pickles, everything. My mother said it was eccentric, a man doing that kind of work. He said it was practical." She said, "The jar on the shelf. The one labeled September preserves. Is that what he called them?" He said, "That's what he called them. September was the best preserving month. He had opinions about it." She said, "Do you know what was in them?" He said, "Apple butter mostly. He had an orchard on the south slope, 20 trees. You probably found the remains of it." She said, "I found 4 trees that are still producing. Vera thinks there's a 5th one that might come back if we work on it this fall." A pause. He said, "There was a particular tree, the one closest to the fence on the southeast corner. Reginald called it the keeper. Said it made better fruit than the rest because it had the most weather, got the most sun, the most wind, the most cold. He said the fruit that grows in difficulty is sweeter than the fruit that grows easy." She sat in the summer garden with the radishes in her hand and the phone against her ear and let that sit. She said, "I'll find it." She did. She found the keeper tree the following week, on the southeast corner of where the orchard had been, a gnarled and heavy-branched apple tree that was already setting fruit in July, early, ahead of the other 3, as if it had been waiting to be found and recognized, and was going ahead without her permission. She stood under it. She put her hand on the bark. She thought about difficulty making things sweeter. She thought about the drainage ditch. She thought, "I know something about that." William came to the estate for the first time in September. He came alone. No lawyers, as she had asked. He drove himself in a truck that was old and clean, the truck of a man who maintained his equipment because maintenance was a value rather than a chore. He pulled in at the gate and she was already there, waiting, because she had asked him to come at 9, and it was 5 to 9, and she had learned in the past 8 months that being early to the things that mattered was another version of paying attention. He got out of the truck. He stood at the gate. He looked at the property. She let him look. He stood there for a long time, looking at the house on the rise, the stone and timber, the covered porch, the chimneys at each end. The kitchen garden visible to the south, green and ordered and full. The oaks beyond the house, still in their September foliage, the gold just starting at the edges of the leaves. The pond catching the morning light. She watched his face. She had been watching people's faces her whole life. The way people watched faces when they didn't have many other things to read, when the face was the primary text available, and she had gotten good at it. She watched his face and saw the same thing she had been watching for since the courtroom. The thing she had seen beginning in January and had been waiting to see complete. The truth changing. Not the legal truth. That had changed in January. The internal truth. The truth that lived in the part of a person below reason, below argument, in the part formed before you were old enough to question it. That truth was slower to change. It needed evidence of a different kind. Not documents and lineage authentication. Evidence of care. Evidence of attention. Evidence that the person who had this thing was going to be the kind of person who deserved it. He stood at the gate for a long time. Then he said, "The south slope." He used to have 20 apple trees on the south slope. She said, "I found 4 of them." "And the keeper?" He turned and looked at her. He said, "You found the keeper." She said, "Southeast corner of where the orchard was. It's already set more fruit than the other 4 combined." He was quiet. Then he said, he would be pleased about that. They walked the property for 2 hours. She showed him the kitchen garden and what Vera had done with it, the expansion along the south wall, the rotation system restored to its original design. He looked at it carefully, walking the rows, and at one point he crouched down and took a handful of soil and held it, turned it over, let it fall through his fingers. He said, "I don't know much about gardening, but I know this is good soil." She said, "Vera says someone took exceptional care of it for decades." He said, "Reginald spent more time in this garden than anywhere else on the property, near the end. Said it was the honest work, that everything you put in you got back." She thought about 37 years of mineral lease revenue compounding into a number. She thought about a trust that returned to its bearer everything Reginald had put into it over a lifetime. She thought, he wasn't just talking about the garden. She showed William the workshop. He stood at Reginald's workbench with his hands on the worn edge and said nothing for a while, just looked at the hand planes on the pegboard, still in their painted outlines. Every one returned to its exact position. He said, "My father said Reginald made all the furniture in the house himself. Every piece. He said it was more stubbornness than skill, but the furniture lasted." She said, "Gil has been repairing the barn with timber from the property stand. He uses the same techniques." He said whoever built this outbuilding knew what they were doing. William looked around the workshop. He said, "Reginald would have built this himself." She said, "I know." She took him to the pond last. They stood at the flat stone at the water's edge, the same stone she had stood on in October when she first walked the property, worn smooth at the center. The September light was coming off the water at the particular angle she had been watching all summer, the one that changed by the hour and by the season, and that she had learned to anticipate the way you learn to anticipate something you paid attention to repeatedly. He stood beside her. He said, "I used to fish this pond when I was a boy. He never stocked it, but it always had fish." He said the land provided what it provided, and it wasn't your place to improve on it. She said, "I've been thinking about building a dock." He looked at her. She said, "Not a big one. Just enough to sit on at this hour. Watch the light." He looked at the water. He said, "That's where he used to sit. On that stone. Every morning before 7. Rain or shine." He said if you wanted to understand a piece of land, you had to see it at the same hour every day across every season. She said, "I've been doing that. Since October." He said, "All seasons?" She said, "Winter, spring, summer, autumn. I haven't missed a morning." He was quiet for a long time. The water moved slightly in the September breeze, the light breaking and reforming across the surface in that particular way it had at this hour, the hammered silver she had thought about since the first morning. He said, "He would have said you're the right person." She said, "I think he did say that. In 1986. He just didn't know my name yet." William made a sound that was close to a laugh. Not a full laugh, but the shape of one, the beginning of something that his face had not done in a long time. He said, "He did things his own way. That was always the truth of him. He saw the world differently than the rest of the family. My father never understood it. I spent most of my life thinking my father was right." He paused. "I'm less certain about that now." She said, "What changed?" He said this. He gestured, not at anything specific, just at the property, at the morning, at the stone and the water and the light. What you've done with it. How you've come at it. He paused. "You're not treating it like money. You're treating it like a responsibility." She said, "It is one." He said, "Most people your age, most people any age, with this amount of money, would be somewhere else entirely." She said, "This is where the money is from. This is where it makes sense to be." He looked at her. He said, "Reginald thought that way." She said, "I know." She knew because she had read his journal 9 times. She knew because she had been walking this land for 8 months and learning it the way Reginald had said you learned it, through repeated presence, through the slow accumulation of particular detail. She knew because she had stood at this stone through winter's ice margin and spring's green edge and summer's still heat, and now September's particular combination of fullness and beginning decline, and she had understood something about the land that she could not have understood from a document or a number or a judge's ruling. The land was patient. The land accumulated. The land returned what you put into it. That was the inheritance, not just the acres, the understanding. In October, she broke ground on the foundation structure. It was not a building. It was a charitable organization, incorporated with Patricia's help and named after 2 women, the Iris and Shirley Foundation. She had not known a Shirley, but she had read enough and thought enough about the chain of women who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to hold something and pass it forward. And Shirley was the name that came to her, the kind of name that meant someone specific even when you didn't know who. Someone who baked and kept promises and left lights on for people they had never met. She told Patricia about the name choice. Patricia said, "It's a good name." The foundation's purpose was specific. She had written the founding document herself, in the plain direct prose her grandmother had used for important things, and the purpose it described was this: to provide transitional housing, legal assistance, and documentary support to people experiencing homelessness who had legitimate claims on property, inheritance, or benefits they lacked the resources or knowledge to access. People in drainage ditches. People without phones and without lawyers and without the particular combination of circumstances that had produced a Nadia Beaumont standing at the right angle on the right morning. Harwell had read the founding document and said, "This is what Reginald intended. Not necessarily this specific form, but this direction." She said, "I know. I read his journal." He said, "March 3rd. She said, "You know it?" He said, "Emmett had the journal photocopied in 1995 for the trust file." He thought it was relevant context. He paused. "Worth and for are different questions. Most people stop at worth." She said, "Emmett really was thorough." He said, "He learned it from Reginald." She had kept the $4.37. She had thought about spending them many times during the 8 months since the hearing. On something small and specific, a marking of the before and after, a way of acknowledging that the emergency fund she had assembled through the years of difficulty had arrived at a moment when it no longer needed to be a fund. But every time she thought about spending it, she found she wasn't ready, and she had learned to trust that feeling. She spent it in October. She bought a small jar of local honey from the farmer's market that set up every Saturday on the Cresswell Town Square. The vendor was an older man who kept bees on his property east of town and who sold his honey in jars he labeled by season: spring blossom, summer clover, autumn wild. She bought the autumn wild. She carried it home to Voss Grange. She put it on the kitchen shelf next to the September preserves and the beeswax candle. She stood at the shelf and looked at the 3 objects. She said, out loud, to the kitchen and to the north-facing windows and to the morning light coming through them, "Iris, this is what you sent me toward. I want you to know I see it." The kitchen was quiet. The light moved across the stone floor the way it always moved, slow and specific and indifferent and beautiful. William came back in November. He did not call ahead. He pulled up to the gate on a Tuesday morning, and she saw his truck from the kitchen window while she was making breakfast, and she went out to meet him. He had a box in his hands. He said, "These were in my father's things. After my father died, I kept them. I didn't know what else to do with them." She took the box. Inside were photographs. Photographs of Voss Grange, decades of them, in black and white and early color and the particular saturated quality of photographs from the 1970s. The house as it had been. The orchard in full bloom. 20 trees in a row on the south slope, their spring flowering so heavy the branches bent. The kitchen garden in summer abundance. The pond in winter with a proper freeze, a man standing on the ice in the center, arms out, laughing. She picked up that photograph. She said, "Is this Reginald?" William said, 1962. He was 63. He skated on that pond every winter that it froze hard enough. He had opinions about how to test the ice. She looked at the photograph. A man at 63 in 1962, arms out on a frozen pond, laughing. The particular joy of a person fully in a place, fully present, fully alive to the specific quality of a winter morning on a pond they had stood at every day for decades. She thought about the flat stone at the water's edge. She thought about the dock she had not yet built. She thought, next winter, if the ice comes, I'll test it the way he did. She would need to learn how. She looked at William. She said, will you show me? He said, show you what? She said, how to test ice. What he knew about this property that isn't in any document. Everything you saw here as a boy, and remember. She held up the box. Everything that goes with these photographs. He looked at the box. He said, that could take a while. She said, I'm not in a hurry. He looked at the property. The November trees, the last of the leaves still holding, the stone house on the rise, the pond just visible through the oaks, cold and silver under the gray November sky. He said, I'll come back. She said, I know you will. He drove out. She stood at the gate with the box of photographs in her arms and watched the truck until it turned off Ridgemont Road and was gone. She looked east along the fence line. The dead tree was still there. She had not touched it, had not cut it down or cleared it, even though the groundwork they had done along the eastern boundary had given her reason to. She had left it because it was Reginald's marker, his chosen place, the specific tree he had watched go gray in 1982 and trusted to hold what he needed to leave. She walked to it. She put her hand on the bark. Still gray, still bare, still standing, the roots buckled into their pattern of cracked ridges, the branches reaching in every direction with the particular patience of something that had been waiting a long time and was not finished waiting yet. She thought, you did your job. She thought, thank you. She stood at the dead tree for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back up the path, past the kitchen garden and the apple trees and the workshop with Reginald's tools and their painted outlines, up to the stone house at the top of the rise, and she went inside. She put the box of photographs on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on the range. She looked out the north window at the kitchen garden, dormant now in November, the soil turned and covered and waiting for spring, which was still months away and was already certain. She thought about the morning she had sat in the underpass with a candle and a piece of paper that said $410 million and made a list. She thought about the list and what was on it and how far each item on it had traveled since that night, what each one had become. She thought about Iris. She thought, this is what proud looks like. Not the asking for things, the receiving of them when they come, and the understanding of what they are for. She poured the tea. She carried it to the main room. She sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, which she had laid that morning and had lit when she came inside. The wood caught, and the room filled with the particular warmth of a fire in a stone house, the warmth that was different from any other kind, that came from every direction at once because the stone held it and gave it back slowly. She put the box of photographs on the floor beside her. She took them out one by one. Reginald on the frozen pond, the orchard in bloom, the kitchen garden in its summer abundance, the house in a photograph that must have been taken the year it was built, everything new and raw and beginning, the stone not yet softened by decades of weather, the timber not yet darkened, the land around it not yet learning the shape of its own life with the house in it. She looked at that photograph for a long time. She thought about beginnings. She thought about the specific beginning she was in, which was not the same as a starting over, because you did not start over from zero. You started from where you were, which was a drainage ditch and a dead tree and a grandmother who said the Voss blood was proud, and all of those things were part of what she was starting from, and none of them were behind her. They were inside her, carried, the way you carried the things that had made you. She set the photograph on the floor. She looked at the fire. She thought, Reginald, I will take care of it. I will learn what it is for. I will stand at the pond at the same hour every day across every season. I will find the keeper tree every September, and I will understand what the difficulty in the growing makes sweeter. I will build the dock. I will restore the orchard. I will fill the shelves with September preserves and autumn honey and the evidence of a life lived in full attention to the specific quality of a place. She thought, I will be what you trusted the universe to send. Outside, the November wind moved through the property, through the oaks and the apple trees and the timber stand, through the kitchen garden's dormant beds, past the pond and the flat stone at its edge, along the eastern fence line, through the bare and patient branches of the dead tree that had held an envelope for 37 years and given it to the right person when she came. The fire burned. The house held. She stayed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.